Clara Bennett lifted her fist and knocked before her courage could break. The door swung open, and a tall, weathered man filled it. She said the words she'd rehearsed across 40 miles of dust. "My father said you needed a wife." The man went still as stone. "Your father was wrong, miss." He started to shut the door. She caught it with a bleeding hand. "Please, he's dead. You're all I have left." Neither of them breathed. If a story like this moves, you take a moment to subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled tonight. The door did not close. Caleb Whitaker stood on his own threshold with one hand flat against the wood and looked down at the woman who had jammed her palm into the gap. She was young, too young to be standing alone at the edge of his land with the light going soft behind her, and nothing at her feet but a carpet bag half the size it should have been. "Take your hand off my door," he said. "No, sir. Miss, not until you've heard me out." Her voice shook, but the hand didn't move. "I walked here. I didn't walk here to be turned around in 10 seconds. Caleb had lived alone for 11 years. In 11 years, exactly 2 people had come up the wagon trace to his cabin uninvited, and both of them had wanted something he wasn't willing to give. He figured this made 3. "You said your father sent you." "He did." "Your father's dead." Her jaw tightened. "That's right. Both those things are true at once. He told me to come to you before he passed, and here I am." She pulled her hand back at last, but only to reach into the front of her coat, and she drew out a letter folded so many times the creases had gone furry and white. She held it up between 2 fingers. He wrote it himself. His hand was shaking so bad at the end, I had to guide the pen. But he said the name plain. Caleb Whitaker. Montana. The man who owes him a life. Caleb didn't take the letter. He looked at it the way a man looks at a snake he isn't sure is dead. "Lot of men named Whitaker," he said. "He said you'd say that." A small, exhausted breath left her. "He said he'll try to weasel out of it. Don't let him. Tell him 2 rivers." Everything in Caleb's chest dropped an inch. 2 rivers. He hadn't heard those 2 words spoken aloud by another living soul in 9 years. He'd said them to himself sometimes in the black middle of a winter night, when the wind found the gaps in the chinking and the cold got into his old wounds and would not let him sleep. 2 rivers, where he'd bled out into the mud with a bullet in his side and a dead horse across his legs, and no reason on God's earth to expect anyone to come. And someone had come. A rough-handed horseman with a gray mustache and a voice like gravel who'd hauled Caleb up out of the muck, thrown him across a saddle, and ridden 2 days through country, crawling with the men who'd shot him, all to set him down on a doctor's porch and vanish before Caleb ever caught his name. Bennett. The name had been Bennett. Caleb's hand came off the door. "You'd best come in," he said, and hated himself for saying it. She sat in the one good chair, and he stood because that was how it needed to be. He wasn't going to sit down across a table from a strange woman like they were courting. He lit the lamp because the light was failing, and he didn't want to be talking to a shadow. "What's your name?" he said. Not really a question. "Clara. Clara Bennett." "And your father was?" "Elias Bennett." She said it like it was a wound. "He trained horses, kept books for other men who trained horses. He was good at both, and he never got rich at either, and that about sums up his whole life if you want it in one sentence." She looked up at Caleb, and her eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the eyes of a woman who had done all her crying already and had none left to spare. "He talked about you. Near the end, when the fever had him. He'd say, 'The Whitaker boy. Did I ever tell you about the Whitaker boy?' And he'd tell me. Same story every time. How he found you left for dead, and how you looked at him and said..." Her voice caught. "You said why, just that. Why? And he never had a good answer, he said. He just couldn't ride past." Caleb turned his face away. "He remembered that, right?" he said low. "He remembered all of it. He remembered your face. He said, 'If I'm ever on the wrong side of hard luck, that boy'll square it. He's the kind that pays what he owes.'" Clara pressed the letter flat on the table with her palm smoothing the awful creases. And then the hard luck came, Mr. Whitaker. It came for both of us. And he had one card left to play, and he played it. He played you. Play me how? He wants you to marry me. The lamp hissed. Outside, one of Caleb's horses blew and stamped in the paddock. No, Caleb said. Clara had clearly expected it. She didn't flinch. You haven't heard why. Don't need to. Answer's the same. A man doesn't marry a woman he's known 8 minutes on account of a debt to her dead father. That's not paying a debt. That's throwing a life away, yours mostly. He crossed his arms. You want money, I'll give you money. I got a little put by. You want a horse to get you back to town, I'll saddle the best one I got and you can keep it. But I'm not going to marry you, miss, and any man who told you I would was doing you a cruelty. He wasn't cruel. She said it fast and hard like a slap. Don't you dare call my father cruel. He was dying and he was scared, not for himself. He wasn't scared of dying. He was scared of what came after for me. Because he knew what happens to a woman with no husband, no father, no money, and no name that means anything to anybody. He knew exactly what happens to a woman like that. And so did I. Her voice climbed and then broke off, and she pressed her lips together and got it back under control by main force. So don't sit up there in your clean cabin with your money put by and tell me a dying man was cruel to try to keep the wolves off his only child. Caleb was quiet a long moment. What wolves? He said. She looked at him. You said the wolves. What wolves exactly? A woman doesn't walk 40 miles to marry a stranger just because it's hard being alone. Hard she could do. You strike me as somebody who could do hard. He watched her. Somebody's after you. For the first time since she'd knocked, Clara Bennett looked away from him. Not me, she said quietly. Not exactly. It's more complicated than that. Then, uncomplicated. She was quiet for a breath. Then two. My father owed money, she said. At the end. The doctoring cost more than we had, and then it cost more than we could borrow, and there was a man in the valley who was glad to lend it. Glad the way a spider's glad. She turned the letter over under her hand. His name is Victor Harrington. He owns the biggest spread in 3 counties, and half the men who wear a badge in it. And when my father died, the note came due, and I couldn't pay it, and Mr. Harrington wrote out personally to tell me what he'd take instead. Her mouth twisted. He was very polite about it. He tipped his hat. Caleb's arms came uncrossed slowly. What did he say he'd take? He said a debt's a debt, and the law's the law, and my father's land was collateral. So the land was his now, which was a lie. The land was never signed to him, but who's going to tell a judge that when the judge dines at his table? She laughed one bitter note. And then he looked at me, standing on the porch of the house I grew up in, and he said maybe we could come to a different arrangement. Him and me. A younger man's wife had recently died on him, he said. And he did admire a woman with fire. The lamp flame stood straight up in the still air. He wanted you, Caleb said. He wanted the land free and clear, and me thrown in like a bridle on a sold horse. She met his eyes again, and now there was steel showing under the exhaustion. So I ran, that night. I took the one thing that man couldn't put a price on, which was my father's word, this letter, this name, your name, and I walked. 40 miles. Because a dead man's promise was the only thing standing between me and Victor Harrington's parlor, and I'd rather have walked 400 miles than sat down in that parlor. So, she lifted her chin. That's the wolf, Mr. Whitaker. That's the whole ugly shape of it. And now you've heard it, and you can still say no, but you can't say I didn't tell you true. Caleb Whitaker stood in his own cabin and understood with the slow certainty of a man watching a storm come over a ridge that his quiet life had just ended. He didn't want it to be true. He'd spent 11 years arranging things so that no one's trouble could reach him. He'd built the fences high and the friendships low. He owed nobody, and nobody owed him, and that was exactly the way he'd meant to keep it right up until they put him in the ground. And now, a dead man he could never repay had reached out of the grave and set his own daughter down in the middle of Caleb's floor, and the debt was real, and the wolf was real, and there wasn't any amount of money in a coffee can that was going to make either of those things go away. "I'm not going to marry you," he said. Clara's face closed like a fist. "But you're going to stay the night," he went on. "Because it's dark, and you can't walk back, and I'm not that kind of man. And in the morning, I'm going to think on it. That's all I can promise you. Thinking." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a smaller voice than she'd used all evening, she said, "That's more than anyone's promised me in 3 weeks. Don't thank me yet." He nodded toward the ladder at the back of the room. "Loft's up there. It's clean. Blankets in the chest. I'll be down here." She rose, and she was unsteady doing it, and Caleb saw for the first time, really saw how far past the edge of her strength she'd walked to get to his door. She swayed and caught the table and made herself straight again. "When did you last eat?" he said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She didn't answer, which was an answer. Caleb went to the stove. He fed her cold biscuit, and last night's beans warmed back up, and he watched her try to eat slow and dignified for exactly 4 bites before hunger took over, and she ate like a woman who'd been walking for a day and a half on nothing but creek water. He didn't say anything about it. He poured her coffee and set it by her hand and turned his back to give her the dignity of it, and he busied himself banking the fire while she finished. "You didn't ask me a thing about myself," he said, not turning around. "What? You come here to marry me. Most women that circumstance, they'd want to know something about the man. Whether he drinks, whether he's got a temper, whether he's the kind that'd raise his hand to a wife." He turned. "You didn't ask any of it." Clara set her fork down. "My father told me who you were," she said simply. "He said you were the kind of man who'd ride 2 days to keep a stranger from dying. I figured I could stand the rest." Something went tight in Caleb's throat, and he had to work to get past it. "Your father put a lot of faith in 8 minutes of my company 9 years ago. He put a lot of faith in what a man does when he thinks nobody's watching." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He said you didn't know he was still watching. You thought you were alone on that doctor's porch, and you took your hat off." She said it like it mattered, like it was the whole point. "You were bleeding through your shirt, and you'd just been carried 2 days across your saddle, and before you passed out, you took your hat off to the empty morning, like you were thanking God or the ground or somebody. And my father said, 'A man does that when he doesn't have to. That's a man you can trust with your daughter.'" Caleb stood very still. "I don't remember that," he said quietly. He did. She looked into her cup. "He remembered it for 9 years, and then he handed it to me like it was money in the bank. And it turns out it was the only money he had left to hand me." The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark, the horse stamped again, and Caleb glanced toward the window out of long habit, the habit of a man who lived alone and had learned to hear the difference between a horse that was restless and a horse that had heard something. "You keep looking at that window," Clara said. "Habit." "No, you did it twice." She was sharper than she looked this one, even worn down to the bone. "Is somebody out there?" "Nobody's out there but my own horses." He said it flat and true, and it was true, and still the unease didn't leave him, because Victor Harrington's name was in his cabin now, and a name like that dragged its trouble behind it like a chain. "Harrington, this man, he know where you went?" "He couldn't. I didn't tell a soul. I didn't say your name out loud to anybody between his valley and your door." "Somebody saw you leave. Somebody always sees. Then they saw a woman walk north with a bag. They didn't see a destination." But she'd gone pale saying it because she was smart enough to hear the hole in her own certainty. "You think he'd come after me all the way up here for 1 debt and 1 woman?" "I think," Caleb said slowly, "that a man who tips his hat while he tells you he owns your land and your body, both is a man who does not care to be told no. And you told him no by leaving, loud as anything." He came away from the window. "Men like that, it stops being about the money real quick. It becomes about the no. They can't abide the no." Clara set her cup down with a small click. "Then you understand why I walked 40 miles, she said. "I'm starting to. She stood steadier now with food in her, and she looked at him across the little cabin with those dry, red-rimmed eyes, and she said, "I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Whitaker. I want to be clear on that, because I think you're the kind of man who'd hear the word marry and think I was asking for something I'm not. I'm asking for a name. A married woman is a fortress. A married woman can't be a widow's arrangement, and she can't be a debt collected in flesh, because the law that protects a man's property protects a husband's wife right along with it, and Victor Harrington lives and dies by that law when it suits him." She took a breath. "I'm asking you to be a wall between me and that man. That's all. You can sleep down here every night of your life for all I care. I'll earn my keep. I can train a horse better than any man you've got, and I can keep your books so clean you'll wonder how you ever lost $1. I'm not a burden. I'm a bargain. Only nobody's ever offered me at a fair price before." Caleb looked at her a long, long moment. "Go to bed, Miss Bennett," he said. "I'll have your answer in the morning." He did not sleep. He lay on the floor by the banked fire with a folded blanket under his head, and his boots still on, and he stared up at the dark rafters and thought about a gray-mustached horseman named Elias Bennett, who'd had no earthly reason to save his life and had done it anyway. He thought about 2 rivers, and the mud, and the weight of the dead horse across his legs, and the certainty he'd felt lying there that this was where he ended. And then the stranger's hands. And then 2 days across a saddle. And then a debt he'd carried 9 years without ever once figuring out how in the world he was supposed to pay it back. And now the bill had come. It hadn't come as money. That would have been easy. Caleb would have given every dollar he owned to square accounts with the man who'd pulled him out of that mud and never even stopped for a thank you. But the world didn't let a man pay his debts in the coin he'd prefer. It sent them due in the coin that cost the most. And this one had come due as a living, breathing, exhausted young woman asleep in his loft, whose only inheritance from her father was Caleb's own long-ago mercy, banked and drawing interest for 9 years. He could send her off with money and a horse. He'd offered it, and it had been an honest offer, and it would have been enough for most debts. But Elias Bennett hadn't asked for money. Elias Bennett had asked for a wall. And Caleb knew, lying there in the dark, hating it, that money wasn't a wall. Money was a thing a man like Harrington could take or twist or wait out. The only wall that held against a man who bent the law to his own hand was a wall built out of that same law. A husband, a name on a paper. The one thing Caleb had sworn 11 years ago he would never put down on paper again for any woman living, because the last time he'd done it, it had cost him everything he'd had to lose, and he'd buried it on a hillside and never gone back. He rolled onto his side and stared at the fire. You could tell her no, he thought. You could give her the money and the horse and tell her no, and it wouldn't make you a bad man. It'd make you a careful one. But he kept hearing it. A man does that when he doesn't have to. That's a man you can trust with your daughter. Elias Bennett had watched him take his hat off to an empty morning 9 years ago and had decided on the strength of that one small unwatched gesture that Caleb Whitaker was a man who could be trusted with the only thing in the world he loved. And Caleb lay on his own floor and thought, if I say no, I make him wrong. A dead man who was right about me his whole life, and I make him wrong with the last thing he ever asked. He was still awake when the gray came in the window. Clara came down the ladder at first light, already dressed, and Caleb was already up. Already had the coffee on, and he handed her a cup without a word, and she took it without a word, and for a minute they just stood in his kitchen, 2 strangers who'd spent a sleepless night 10 feet apart, saying nothing. You didn't sleep either, she said finally. No. Did you think on it? I did nothing but. She waited. She had the good sense not to push. She stood there with the coffee and let him come to it in his own time, and Caleb was grateful for that. Grateful in a way he couldn't have explained, because a woman who could stand in a silence without needing to fill it was a rarer thing than gold. I'll do it, he said. Clara went very still. But you're going to hear the terms, he went on, same as I heard yours, because I mean to be as plain with you as you were with me, and I won't have you agreeing to something you don't understand. He set his cup down. I was married before, long time ago. She died. I won't say more than that except to tell you I did not take it well, and I don't intend to take it again. So if you had any notion in your head that time might turn this into something, put it down. I'm marrying you to be a wall. Just like you said. That's the beginning and the end of it. I understand. You'll have your own room. This cabin's small, but I'll build on. You'll never have to wonder about a lock on a door in my house. He held her eyes so she'd know he meant it. You said you'd earn your keep, and I'll hold you to it because I don't take charity, and I won't give it. You'll pull your weight, and you'll be a partner in this place, full and fair, and any man who says a word sideways about my wife will answer to me. But it's a business between us, Miss Bennett. You need to know that going in. A cold offer. That's all I've got to give. Clara Bennett looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that he couldn't read. My father was wrong about one thing, she said. What's that? He said you were a warm man underneath. He said the coldness was just weather, and underneath it you were warm. She almost smiled. But that's all right. I didn't come here for warm. I came here for a wall. And a wall you can build out of cold just fine. She set her cup down beside his. I accept your terms, Mr. Whitaker. All of them. Caleb nodded once, and the thing was done, and neither of them felt like it was a happy thing. And both of them felt underneath the enormous relief of a door closing on a howling wind. There's a preacher in Hollow Creek, he said. 2 hours ride. We'll go today. Sooner it's real, the safer you are. Today. She breathed it out. All right. You got a dress that isn't... He gestured vaguely at the road dust that had settled into every seam of her. I've got one dress that isn't this one. It was my mother's. I'll wear it. Then wear it, he said. And Clara? It was the first time he'd used her Christian name, and it stopped them both for half a second. When we ride into that town, you let me do the talking. You don't know these people. I do. Some of them are decent, and some of them would sell their own grandmother for the price of a beer, and you can't always tell which is which by looking. Harrington's got money, and money's got a long reach, so we keep it simple. We're getting married, we don't say why, and we don't say where you came from. You understand? I understand. Good. He reached for his hat off the peg by the door and set it on his head. Then let's go get you your wall. Hollow Creek was the kind of town that had learned suspicion the way other towns learned a trade thoroughly and early and passed down from father to son. Caleb had known it for 11 years, and it had never once made him feel welcome, and he'd never once wanted it to. And he saw right away from the way the street went quiet when he rode in with a woman on the horse behind him that today was not going to be the day the town of Hollow Creek surprised him. That's Whitaker, somebody said. Not quiet enough. Whitaker's got a woman. Keep riding, Caleb said low, and Clara kept riding. The preacher's house sat at the end of the street past the mercantile, and to get to it, they had to pass the whole length of the town, every porch and every window, and Caleb felt the eyes on his wife's back like hands. He'd forgotten what this felt like. He'd spent 11 years arranging his life, so he'd never have to feel it, the weight of a town's curiosity, the low hum of a place deciding what it thought of you before you'd said a word. He'd forgotten, and now he remembered, and he hated it fresh. Outside the mercantile, a knot of men stood watching them come, and one of them stepped down off the porch into the street. Caleb knew him. Everybody knew him. His name was Sam Doyle, and he ran his mouth for a living, and did nothing else for anybody, and he'd never had a kind word for a soul that couldn't buy him a drink. Well now. Doyle planted himself in the road, not quite in the way, but near it. Caleb Whitaker. Ain't seen you in town since. He made a show of thinking, since I don't rightly know when, and here you come with a lady. Where'd a man like you find a lady, Whitaker? Caleb reined in, because he had to. The man was near enough the horse that riding on would have meant riding through him. Morning, Doyle, Caleb said. Nothing else. She's a pretty one. Doyle looked up at Clara, and his eyes did the slow crawl that Caleb had seen 100 men's eyes do, and Caleb felt something old and dangerous wake up in his chest. "You buy her, Whitaker, or she just wander up your mountain by mistake." "Step out of the road, Doyle. I'm just being friendly." Doyle grinned around at his audience. "Man doesn't come to town in 11 years, then rides in with a woman nobody's laid eyes on. Folks are gonna wonder. That's all. Folks wonder." He looked back up at Clara. "You all right up there, miss? You blink twice if he's got you against your—" Caleb was off the horse before he'd decided to be. He didn't hit the man. He wanted to. But he'd learned a long time ago that a man who hits first in a town like this has handed that town its story, and the story becomes Whitaker's violent instead of Doyle's a fool, and Caleb had spent 11 years being nobody's story, and he wasn't going to change that today. So he didn't hit him. He just stepped in close enough that the grin died on Doyle's face, and he said quiet, so only the front row could hear, "This lady is going to be my wife inside the hour. And when she is, every insult you just laid at her feet is an insult laid at mine. Now you can spend the rest of your life in this town being the man who insulted Caleb Whitaker's wife the day they wed, or you can tip your hat and say good morning to Mrs. Whitaker, and we'll all forget this happened. Your choice, Sam." A beat. "I'd choose fast." The street had gone dead silent. Doyle's throat worked. His eyes went from Caleb's face to the ring of watching men and back, doing the arithmetic that a certain kind of small man always does, how much face he'd lose by backing down against how much skin he'd lose by not. And skin won the way it usually did with that kind. Slowly, Doyle raised his hand and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he said, sour as a green apple. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Clara said, cool and clear from up on the horse and not one tremor in it. And Caleb thought, there's the horse trainer, there's the bookkeeper, there's the woman who walked 40 miles. He swung back up in front of her and clicked the horse forward, and they rode the rest of the way to the preacher's door, through a silence that had entirely changed its flavor. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said quietly behind him. "Yes, I did. He'll hate you for it now. He hated me before. Now he'll just be quieter about it." Caleb reined up at the preacher's gate. "That's the most a man can hope for in a place like this. Not to be loved, just to be too much trouble to bother." The preacher was an old man named Ansel Cobb, and he'd married and buried half of Hollow Creek in his time, and he'd stopped being surprised by anything the human race got up to somewhere around the second decade of it. He looked at Caleb, and he looked at Clara, and he did not ask a single one of the questions that a younger man might have asked. "You're of age, the both of you, marrying free. No other man or woman got a lawful claim on either." "Yes," Caleb said. "Yes," said Clara. "Then I don't need to know the rest, and I expect you'd rather I didn't." Cobb reached for his book. "I've married folks for love, and I've married folks for land, and I've married folks for reasons they took to their graves without telling me. And do you know what I've learned in 50 years of it?" Neither of them answered. "That it don't much matter why two people stand up in front of God," the old man said, opening the book. "It matters what they do the morning after. Love that starts hot burns out. I've buried the marriages to prove it. But a marriage that starts as a promise kept—" He looked up at Caleb over his spectacles, and there was something almost gentle in it. "That's a fire that can catch slow. I've buried fewer of those." He found his place. "Take her hand, son. You can't make a promise to a woman standing 3 feet off from her." Caleb hesitated. Then he reached back and Clara put her hand in his, and her fingers were cold and steady, and his were steady too, and the old preacher began to read the words that would build Clara Bennett her wall. And Caleb Whitaker, standing in a dim front room with a stranger's cold hand in his, and a dead man's promise finally coming due, found that he could not quite look at her while the words were said, because if he looked at her, he was afraid of what his own face might do, and he had sworn 11 years ago that his face would never do that again. He kept his eyes on the preacher. He said, "I do," to the ceiling, and 40 miles to the south, in a valley where the biggest house threw the longest shadow. A rider was already saddling a fast horse because a man named Victor Harrington had spent 3 weeks looking for a woman who'd told him no. And that very morning, a talkative fellow passing through from a town called Hollow Creek had mentioned over a beer he hadn't paid for that the strangest thing had happened up north. Caleb Whitaker had come down out of his mountain, and Caleb Whitaker had gone and got himself married. They rode back up the mountain, married, and neither of them said a word about it for the first hour. It was Clara who broke it, and she broke it the way she seemed to break most silences sideways from an angle Caleb didn't see coming. "You said, 'I do' to the ceiling," she said. Caleb kept his eyes on the trace ahead. "Did I?" "You did, the whole time. I had a fine view of the side of your face, and you never once looked at me. You looked at that water stain on Preacher Cobb's ceiling like it owed you money." "I was concentrating. On the ceiling. On not making a mistake." Behind him, he felt rather than heard the small breath she let out, not quite a laugh. "Well," she said, "I've been married a whole 2 hours now, and my husband has never looked me in the eye. My mother would have a great deal to say about that." "Your mother's not here." "No." Clara agreed, and the lightness went out of it. "No, she's not." Caleb regretted it the moment it was out of his mouth, and he was a man who did not often regret his words, because he did not often waste any. He rode on for a minute chewing on it, and then he said gruff, "That came out harder than I meant it. It's all right. It's not. You lost your father 3 weeks ago, and I threw your dead mother at you to win a conversation I wasn't even losing." He shook his head. "That was small of me." Clara was quiet a moment. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Take a thing back. Most men, they say the hard thing, and then they just let it sit there and go rotten because taking it back would cost them something. You gave it right back. Not even a full minute later. "My wife's been dead 11 years, Caleb said, and he didn't know why he said it, except that the mountain was wide and quiet, and she was the first person he'd talked to for more than a passing minute in longer than he could recall. You want to know a thing about grief nobody tells you. It's the small, unkind things that keep you up at night. Not the big ones. The big ones you can forgive yourself because you were out of your mind. It's the small ones. The little cruelties you had time to think about and did anyway. Those are the ones that come back." He clicked to the horse. "I've got enough of those. I'm not adding to the pile with you." Clara didn't answer that, but when they'd ridden another 100 yards, she said quietly, "Thank you." And Caleb understood she wasn't thanking him for taking it back. She was thanking him for the marriage, for the whole of it, for a thing too big to name out loud, and she'd found a small doorway to say it through. "Don't thank me," Caleb said. "You haven't seen the work yet." The work was the making of them in the end, though neither of them could have known it that first week. Caleb had thought in the thin gray hours of the night he'd lain awake making his decision that the hard part would be the living together. Two strangers in a small cabin. He'd braced for the awkwardness of it, for the 1,000 small collisions of two lives that had never learned to share a doorway. He'd built her a wall out of his own name, and he'd expected to spend the rest of his life on the cold side of it, polite and distant, two people passing coffee across a table until they were old. What he had not braced for was that Clara Bennett could actually work. He found it out the second morning when he went to the paddock at first light and found her already there up on the top rail watching his big roan gelding, the one nobody could get a saddle on, the one he'd half decided to sell for what he could get, because a horse a man can't ride is just an expensive way to feed flies. "Get down off there," he said. "That one's mean." "He's not mean." Clara didn't move. "He's scared. There's a difference, and it matters a great deal to the horse." She tilted her head. "Somebody hurt him. Right side. Watch how he won't turn his off eye toward you. He keeps you on his left the whole time. Somebody came at him from the right once and hurt him bad, and now he won't give a soul his blind side. You've been fighting him for months, haven't you?" Caleb stopped walking. "How'd you know that?" "Because you called him mean, and men call a horse mean when the horses beat them." She climbed down off the rail slow on the left side, keeping herself in the roan's good eye the whole way. "My father used to say there's no such thing as a bad horse. Only a horse that's asking a question nobody bothered to answer." She held out her hand, palm down low, and she waited, and she did not move toward the animal at all. She just stood there and let him decide. "What's his name?" "Doesn't have one. I don't name what I can't ride." "That's your whole trouble right there," Clara murmured. And she wasn't talking to Caleb anymore. She'd gone soft and low, all her attention on the roan. "Nobody named you, did they? Nobody named you, and nobody answered your question, and everybody called you mean." The horse's ears came forward. His off eye rolled, showing white, and then slowly. Slowly he turned his head, and for the first time in the 8 months Caleb had owned him, that horse gave a human being his blind side on purpose. Caleb watched his own untamable horse lower its head into a strange woman's hand, and he felt something turn over in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not want one. "Well," he said when he could, "I'll be damned." "Probably," Clara agreed, not looking at him, both hands on the roan now, and there was the first real smile he'd seen on her, small and private, aimed entirely at a horse. "But not today. Today you've got a horse you can ride, and I've earned my breakfast, so we're both ahead." He named the roan that evening. He called him Elias. He didn't tell Clara why, and he didn't have to, and when she heard him say it low to the horse at the fence, "Easy, Elias, easy." Now she went still at the cabin door with the wash water in her hands, and stood there a long moment before she went inside, and she didn't say a word about it either. That was how it went those first 2 weeks. Not with words. With small things laid down carefully one at a time, like stones set in a creek, so a person can cross without getting swept off. He gave her the roan's trust, and she gave him back a horse worth 4 times what he'd have sold it for. She found the books he'd been keeping, which were not books at all, just a cigar box of receipts and a great deal of hoping. And she spread them out on the table one night without asking, and worked at them by lamplight for 3 hours. And when she was done, she looked up at him with a face gone flat with a kind of professional outrage and said, "Mr. Whitaker, the man you buy your winter feed from has been robbing you for years, cheerfully, to your face. Did you know that?" "I figured his prices were high." "His prices are theft. I've seen his numbers against 3 other suppliers I know of down south, and he's charging you near double, and I'd bet my mother's dress he does it because you're the man who comes to town once a year and never argues and never checks. You're easy money to him. You've been easy money to that whole town for 11 years. She stabbed a finger at the receipts. "Not anymore. I'll write the letters myself." "You'll write letters." "I'll write letters." She said it like a woman declaring a war. "You just have to sign them." "And what's that going to save me?" Clara did some figuring, her lips moving, her pencil scratching. Then she turned the paper around and pushed it across the table, and Caleb looked at the number at the bottom, and then he looked at it again. "That can't be right." "It's right. In a year." "Every year," Clara said. "Every year since you built this place, that number's been walking out of your pocket and into that man's, and you never felt it because you never counted it. That's what I do, Mr. Whitaker. That's the thing my father taught me that I'm actually good at. Anybody can add. I can find." She sat back, and there was color in her face now. The first real color he'd seen since she'd walked up his trace, half dead. And Caleb understood he was looking at a person who had just for the first time in 3 weeks remembered that she was good at something. "I told you I'd be a bargain," she said quieter. "I meant it. I don't want to be somebody you rescued. I've got no use for that." "You're not," Caleb said, and found he meant it. "I've got a hand who can gentle a horse nobody could touch and catch a thief I've been feeding for a decade. That's not rescuing. That's the best hire I ever made." He tapped the number on the paper. "Write your letters. I'll sign whatever you put in front of me." She smiled at that, quick and pleased, and looked back down at the receipts, and Caleb sat across the table from her in the lamplight, and thought with a small cold shock like stepping into creek water that he had not sat across a lamplit table from another living person in 11 years, and that he had somehow forgotten it was a thing a man could miss. He put the thought away. He'd made a rule. A cold offer he'd told her. A business. He wasn't going to be the fool who wrote a rule down one morning and started breaking it by the second week. He got up and banked the fire and said goodnight, and he went to the lean-to. He'd started building against the cabin's north wall, because he'd meant what he said about her having her own room, and he wasn't a man to say a thing and not do it. And he lay out there on a cot under a half-finished roof and listened to the small sounds of another person moving in his house, and he did not sleep for a long while. And he told himself it was because the roof wasn't finished, and the night was cold. The first sign that the mountain had stopped being far enough came 11 days after the wedding. Caleb had ridden down to Hollow Creek for salt and nails alone, because he still didn't like the idea of Clara in that town, and he was loading the wagon outside the mercantile when the storekeeper, a fat, cautious man named Pruitt, who'd never given Caleb more than the weather in 11 years, leaned across a barrel of nails and said low, not looking at him, "Fella was in here, day before yesterday, asking after you." Caleb kept loading. "Fellas ask after me all the time. I'm a fascinating man." "Not funny, Whitaker." Pruitt wiped his hands on his apron, still not meeting Caleb's eye, and Caleb understood the man was scared, and Pruitt didn't scare easy, and that was its own kind of information. This one wasn't from around here. City clothes. Good boots. The soft-handed kind that don't work but always got money. He glanced up quick, then away. Asked did I know a Caleb Whitaker. Asked was it true you'd got married recent. Asked did anybody know where the woman came from. Caleb's hands went still on the sack of salt. What'd you tell him? Nothing. Told him I mind my own trade and other men's business is other men's business. Pruitt's jaw worked. But Whitaker, I wasn't the only man he asked. And this town's got mouths. You know that better than anybody. Somebody told him something. Probably Doyle. Doyle'd tell a rattlesnake his own mother's whereabouts for the price of a drink. Caleb set the salt down slow. This soft-handed fella, he said. He's still in town. Rode out yesterday morning, south. Pruitt finally looked at him full on, and there was real warning in it now. The warning of a man who's decided to spend some of his own safety on a thing. South and fast, Whitaker. Like a man carrying news. I don't know what you got yourself into up on that mountain. I don't want to know. But whoever that woman's running from, he's found her. Or he's about to. And a man doesn't send a paid rider 40 miles to ask polite questions unless he means to follow the answers up with something a good deal less polite. Caleb rode home hard. He didn't mean to. He'd meant to keep it easy, keep the wagon steady, not lather the horse, not let the thing show on his face when he got up the mountain because Clara had enough weighing on her without watching her husband ride in, wearing his fear. But somewhere on the trace, his hands had their own opinion, and the horse felt it. And by the time the cabin came in sight, he was moving faster than the load wanted, and his jaw was set like a stone. Clara was in the paddock with the roan. She took one look at his face across the yard and came off the rail and had the gate open before he'd even reined in. "What happened?" she said. "Not hello, not how was town, just straight to it. What happened?" "Nothing happened. Caleb." It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. in front of it, and it stopped them both for half a heartbeat, and then she pushed right past it because there wasn't time for it. "You rode that horse up the last quarter mile like the devil was behind you. Don't tell me nothing happened. I walked 40 miles running from something. I know what a man looks like when the thing he's running from just got closer. You've got that face, right now. So tell me." Caleb looked at her a long moment, and he made a decision he'd think about later in the nights to come the decision to tell her the truth. Because the easy thing, the protecting thing, would have been to shade it, to soften it, to give her half of it, and hold the frightening half back. That was what a man did for a woman he was trying to shield. But he looked at Clara Bennett standing there with her chin up and her jaw set, a woman who'd walked 40 miles rather than be lied to about her own life, and he understood that shading the truth for her would not be protecting her. It would be insulting her. And she'd walked too far and lost too much to be insulted by the one man who was supposed to be her wall. "A man came to town asking after us," he said, 2 days back. City clothes, hired hand kind, the sort that carries a rich man's questions. Asked, did I get married? Asked where you came from. He climbed down. He rode out yesterday morning, south, fast. The color went out of Clara's face, but she didn't stagger and she didn't reach for the fence. She just went still and pale and absolutely steady, and Caleb thought not for the first time that this was a strong woman he'd married, stronger than she probably knew herself. "South," she said, "toward Harrington's Valley." "Then he's got a name now." Clara's voice was flat and careful. "Whoever it was, he's riding back to Harrington with a name and a town. Whitaker. Hollow Creek. Married." She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and opened them. "How long?" "Before Harrington knows. He might know already. Depends how fast that rider rode, and how bad he wanted his pay." Caleb tied off the wagon horse. 40 miles down, 40 back if he comes himself, and a man like that'll want to come himself. Men like that always want to see the thing with their own eyes. So call it 3-4 days. Maybe less. 4 days. Clara pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. 4 days and then what? He rides up here and what? He can't take me. I'm your wife now. That was the whole point. That's the wall, that's the... She stopped, because she'd seen it on Caleb's face. "What? What is it? You just went somewhere behind your eyes. What is it you're not saying?" "The wall holds against the law," Caleb said quietly. "It holds against a man who plays by rules. You're my lawful wife, and no court in the territory will let a man collect a married woman for a dead man's debt. That part of the wall is good and solid, and it'll hold." He met her eyes. "But you told me yourself. This man stopped being about the money the minute you told him no. You said it. It becomes about the no. And a wall built out of the law only stops a man who cares about the law." He let it sit. "I don't think Victor Harrington rode all the way up here to lose politely." Clara stared at him. "You think he'll come anyway," she said, "even knowing it's illegal, even knowing I'm married." "I think," Caleb said, "that a man who owns half the badges in 3 counties has spent a long time learning that the law's just a fence, and a fence only stops the man who agrees to stand behind it." He picked up the sack of salt and swung it up onto his shoulder. "So we're going to stop pretending the law's a wall, Clara. It's not a wall, it's a start. We're going to need more than a preacher's paper. We're going to need to be ready." That was the day the marriage of Caleb Whitaker and Clara Bennett stopped being a business and started without either of them noticing the exact moment being something they were both willing to fight for. They didn't talk about it that way. They didn't talk about it any way at all. But the shape of their days changed after that afternoon, and the change told the truth, even where the words didn't. Caleb started teaching her the land, not the pretty parts, the useful parts. Where the high trail came up the back of the property that a man could use to come at the cabin without being seen from the front. Where the spring was the real spring, the one that fed the whole place, tucked up in a fold of rock, a stranger would ride right past. "A man wants to herd a ranch in this country," he told her, crouched at the spring's edge. "He doesn't burn your house. Houses you can rebuild. He fouls your water. He dams it, or he poisons it, or he runs his cattle through it till it's mud. You lose your water in this country, you lose everything, and you lose it slow enough that you can watch it happen and can't stop it. So you learn this spring. You learn every foot of the ground between it and the cabin, because if it comes to it, this is the thing they'll go for. You think they know about the spring? Harrington's the biggest rancher in 3 counties. A man doesn't get that big without knowing where every drop of water in the territory sits." Caleb straightened. "He'll know. Men like him always know about the water. It's the only thing they really care about." And Clara, for her part, started teaching him something too, though it took him a while to understand that's what she was doing. She started making him talk. It began small, and it began like most things with Clara sideways. At supper one night, she asked him where he'd learned to build, because the cabin was well built, better than a lone man usually bothered with. And Caleb answered short. His father had been a builder, and Clara asked another question, and then another, and Caleb found himself without quite deciding to telling her about his father, a hard, quiet man who'd taught him to hang a door square, and never once told him he loved him, and had died believing that a square door said it better than words could. And Clara listened, really listened with her chin in her hand, and asked the exact right next question every time, And Caleb talked more that one supper than he'd talked in the previous 11 years combined. And when he finally caught himself doing it, he stopped dead and said half accusing, "You're doing something. I'm eating my supper. You're getting me to talk. On purpose. You do it like you gentle that horse. Same thing. You just stand there real still and wait and let a man come to your hand." He set down his fork. "I told you this was a business, Clara." "You did." "I meant it. I know you did." She wasn't ruffled. She never seemed to be ruffled. "And you can keep meaning it. I'm not trying to make you love me, Caleb. I told you I wasn't, and I don't lie about things that big." She looked at him steady across the lamp. "But you're my husband, and there's a man riding up this mountain to do us harm. And when he gets here, I would like to be standing next to somebody I actually know. That's all. Not somebody I share a name with on a paper. Somebody I know. Because I think when the hard thing comes, it matters whether the two people facing it know each other's hearts." She picked her fork back up. "That's not love. That's just not being strangers when it counts. You can allow me that much and still keep your rule." Caleb sat with that a long time. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said finally, and it was the first time in 11 years he'd said the name out loud, and it came out rough like a thing that had rusted from disuse. Clara went still and set her fork down, and didn't say a word because she knew the way she seemed to know everything that a man doesn't say a name like that unless he's decided to, and the worst thing you can do is thank him for it before he's through. "She died having our boy," Caleb said. "The boy died too. Same night, same hour near about." He was looking at the lamp, not at Clara. "I was 27. Same age you are now, come to think of it. And I decided that night that I was done. Not done living, I didn't have the nerve to be done living, and anyway, there's no honor in it. But done reaching, done wanting things I could lose. I figured out real quick that everything that had ever hurt me was a thing I'd wanted, and the fix was simple. Stop wanting. Want nothing, and there's nothing left to take from you." He finally looked at her. "That's why I live up here alone. That's why I've got no friends in that town, and I like it that way. It's not that I'm cold, Clara, whatever your father thought. It's that I found out I could make myself into a man with nothing to lose, and a man with nothing to lose can't be hurt, and I have wanted more than I've ever wanted anything to never be hurt like that again." The lamp hissed in the quiet. "And then I walked up your mountain," Clara said softly. "And then you walked up my mountain." Caleb's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite the opposite. "With a dead man's letter, and 2 rivers on your lips, and now I've got a wife, and a horse named Elias, and a ledger I actually understand, and a rich man riding up here to burn it all down. And do you know what the worst part is?" He shook his head slowly. "The worst part is that 11 years of having nothing to lose just ended. It ended the morning I said I do to that ceiling, because now there's a this to lose. And I did that to myself. I walked right into it with my eyes open." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said very simply, "I'm sorry." "Don't be." "I am, though. You built yourself a whole life around not having anything to lose, and I walked in and handed you something." She looked down at her hands. "That's a cruel thing to do to a man, even by accident." "I didn't think about it that way till just now." "It's not cruel," Caleb said, and he surprised himself with how sure he sounded. "It's the least cruel thing that's happened to me in 11 years. It's just new. And I'm a man who got very used to nothing being new." He stood and gathered the plates, and the moment closed over gentle, the way deep water closes over a dropped stone. "We should sleep. Long day tomorrow. I want to walk you up the high trail before it's light so you know it in the dark, because if trouble comes, it'll come in the dark. Trouble always does." They walked the high trail before dawn, and Clara learned it. And she learned the spring and the back of the property, and where a man could stand watch and see the whole trace laid out below. She learned to load Caleb's rifle, and where he kept it, and where he kept the second one she didn't know about until he showed her. And Caleb learned that his wife did not flinch from any of it, that she took each hard fact and turned it over and put it away in that quick, sharp mind of hers, like a coin in a purse, and that when he handed her the rifle and stood behind her and put his hands over hers to steady the aim, she was steady, already steadier than he was, and it was Caleb whose hands weren't quite sure, and he told himself it was the cold. On the third day, the thing they'd been waiting for arrived, but it didn't come the way Caleb had guessed. It didn't come as a rider. It came as a letter. A boy brought it up the trace on a spent pony at midday, a boy of maybe 14 from a homestead down the mountain, and he wouldn't come all the way to the cabin, just sat his pony at the edge of the yard, looking scared, and held the letter out at arm's length, like it might bite. "Man in town paid me $2 to bring this up," the boy said. "$2 whole, mister. Said give it to Whitaker or the Whitaker woman, and don't read it, and don't stop for nothing." He swallowed. "Can I have my money now? He said you'd give me the other $2. Said the man'd give me $2 for bringing it. That's $4 total. Mister, that's more money than—" "Easy, son." Caleb walked out and took the letter and gave the boy his $2, and then gave him 2 more. Besides, and the boy's eyes went round, and Caleb said quiet, "You did right. Now here's the important part. You ride home, and you don't come back up this mountain. You hear me? No matter who pays you. No matter how much. You stay off this trace till I ride down and tell you it's clear. Can you do that?" The boy looked at the $4 in his fist, and then at Caleb's face, and whatever he saw in it made him nod fast and hard. "Yes, sir." "Good boy. Go on home." The boy went fast, and Caleb stood in the yard with the letter, and did not open it, and Clara came and stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You know who it's from?" Clara said. "I know who it's from." "Open it." He opened it. It was 1 page in a fine flowing hand, the hand of an educated man, or a man who paid for one, and Caleb read it once to himself, and his face went hard and still, and then Clara said, "Read it to me, out loud, all of it. Don't you dare shade it." And Caleb read it to her out loud, all of it, because he'd promised her the truth, and he kept his promises. "Mr. Whitaker," it read, "we have not had the pleasure. I am given to understand you have recently taken a wife. I am further given to understand that your new bride is a young woman lately, of my own valley, a Miss Clara Bennett, daughter of the late Elias Bennett, who died owing me a considerable sum. I am a patient man, and a reasonable one, and I bear you no ill will. You have after all done me the small service of locating a debtor who had rather rudely absconded. I write only to inform you that the debt did not die with the father. It descends as debts do to the estate, and Miss Bennett is her father's whole estate. She carries what he owed. In taking her as your wife, sir, you have taken on her debts as your own. This is the law, and I am a great respecter of the law. I will call upon you within the week to discuss the terms of settlement. I trust we can conduct our business as gentlemen. V. Harrington." Caleb lowered the letter. Clara had gone white to the lips. "He's turning it into money," she said. That's clever, Caleb. That's devil's clever. He knows the marriage protects me. He knows he can't collect me anymore. So he's not coming for me. He's coming for the debt. And a debt he can collect. A debt is legal. A debt he can take to any judge in the territory, and the judge'll say, pay up or lose the ranch, and he owns the judges, so—" Her voice cracked. "So he takes your land instead of me. He takes everything you built. He turns your whole life into the price of my father's doctor bills. And there's not a court in the world that'll say he's wrong, because on paper he's right." She turned to Caleb, and there was something worse than fear in her face. Now there was guilt, black and total. "I did this to you. I walked up your mountain, and I hung my father's debt around your neck, and now he's going to take your whole life to pay it, and it's my fault, and you should have—" "Stop. You should have given me the money and the horse and sent me on. You said you'd give me money. Why didn't I just take the money? Why did I have to—" "Clara, stop." Caleb took her by both shoulders, and it was the first time he'd touched her since the preacher had joined their hands, and she stopped and looked up at him, and her eyes were wet. At last, the tears she'd been holding back for 3 weeks finally spilling over, and Caleb felt each one of them like a coal against his skin. "Listen to me. You did not do this to me. Harrington did this. You hear the difference. You didn't hang anything around my neck. That man's been hunting you like an animal, and now he's hunting me too, and that's on him. Not you. Him." He gave her one small shake, gentle. "And I want you to hear something else, and I want you to hear it plain, because I'm not a man who says things twice. I don't regret it. I said I do to a ceiling, and I meant it, and I don't take it back. You understand? Whatever this costs, and it might cost plenty. I walked into it a grown man with my eyes open, and I'd do it again." "You'd lose your ranch," Clara whispered. "For a woman you knew 8 minutes." "I'd lose my ranch," Caleb said, "for a promise to a man who lost 2 days of his life so I could keep the rest of mine." "That's the whole of it, Clara. That's the arithmetic. Your father spent his own safety on a stranger once. I reckon I can spend a ranch." He let go of her shoulders slow. "But here's the thing he's got wrong, this Harrington. Here's the thing, men like him always get wrong, and it's going to cost him." Caleb held up the letter. "He thinks I'll fold. He thinks I'll look at what it costs to fight, and I'll do the sums, and I'll fold, because that's what everybody's always done. Everybody in that valley folded to him. Your own father folded to him, and he's never once in his life met a man who looked at the price of no and paid it anyway." His jaw set. "He's about to." Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand, hard angry at her own tears. "You can't fight the law, Caleb. He's got the law. He said it himself. On paper, he's right." "On his paper, he's right," Caleb said. "In his valley, he's right in front of his judge, he's right. But this isn't his valley, and the territory's a big place, and there's law, and there's law." He looked south down the mountain toward the valley where a rich man was oiling his machinery. "You keep books. You told me you don't just add, you find. Well, I'll bet you a year's wages a man like Harrington's got books too. Big ones. And I'll bet you those books have got things in them a man wouldn't want a federal court to find, because a man doesn't get to own half the badges in 3 counties by playing straight. He gets there by cheating, and cheating leaves a trail, and a trail can be followed." He turned back to her, and there was a hard light in his eyes that Clara had not seen before, the light of a man who had just stopped playing defense. "He wrote us a letter to scare us into folding. But he made one mistake in it, Clara. He put it in writing. He put his name to a claim that your father's land was signed to him, and you told me yourself that's a lie. The land was never signed. So now I've got a rich man's signature on a lie. In my hand." He folded the letter carefully and put it inside his coat over his heart, like a thing worth keeping. "That's not a threat anymore, Clara. That's evidence, and I aim to go get a great deal more of it." Clara stared at him, and slowly, through the fear and the guilt and the drying tears, something else began to come up in her face, something that had been beaten down for 3 weeks and was only now remembering how to stand. "You want to go on the attack," she said. "I want to stop waiting for that man to come up my mountain," Caleb said. "I want to be down his mountain before he gets to mine. I've spent 11 years being nobody's trouble, Clara. I'm about to be somebody's. He'll kill you." She said it flatly, not as a fear, but as a fact. "You understand that men like that, when the money and the law don't work, they don't just shrug and walk away. He'll send men, in the night, and they won't come with letters." "I know it." "Then we do it together," Clara said. And there was iron in it, and Caleb opened his mouth to argue, and she rode right over him. "No, don't. Don't you dare tell me to stay up here where it's safe, while you ride down there and get yourself killed for my father's debt. I didn't walk 40 miles to hide in a cabin. You said I was a partner in this place, full and fair. You said it at the very start. It was in your terms. Well, a partner doesn't hide. If Harrington's got books, I'm the one who can read them. You need me. You know you need me. So we go together, or I follow you down that mountain on foot, and you know I'll do it because you know exactly how far I'm willing to walk." She crossed her arms. "Now, which is it going to be?" Caleb looked at his wife of 11 days, this woman who had come to his door with nothing, and had already gentled his meanest horse and caught his oldest thief, and stood down Sam Doyle in the middle of the street and refused. absolutely refused to be the person he saved, and he felt the last of his 11-year fortress come down inside him, quiet without a sound, like a wall of snow sliding off a warm roof. "Together," he said. Something eased in Clara's shoulders. "Together," she agreed. "But we do it my way, and we do it smart, because your way of doing things is to charge straight at the thing. And I've noticed that about you, and it's going to get you killed if we're not careful." He was already thinking 3 steps down the mountain in his mind. "We don't ride into his valley shooting. We ride in quiet. We find out who down there hates him, and somebody always hates a man like that. Somebody he's ruined, somebody he's cheated, somebody whose water he stole. We find that person. We find the trail. We build the thing up piece by piece until it's too big for even his judges to swallow. And then," he stopped. Because Clara was looking past him over his shoulder down the trace, and the color had drained clean out of her face again, and her hand had come up to her mouth. Caleb turned. Down at the bottom of the long trace where it came up off the valley road and started its climb toward the cabin, 3 riders had just come into view. They were coming slow. They were coming easy. They were in no particular hurry at all, the way men are in no hurry when they don't expect the thing they're riding toward to run. And even from that distance, even that far off, Caleb could see that the man in front rode a fine tall horse and wore a fine pale coat and sat his saddle like a man who had never once in his life ridden toward anything that could tell him no. "He said within the week," Clara whispered. "He lied," Caleb said. "Men like him always come early. They like to catch you before you're ready." He reached back without looking and found Clara's hand and gripped it once hard and let it go. "Go inside. Get the second rifle, the one under the floor by the stove, the one I showed you. Don't come out. Don't show yourself in that window. And whatever you hear me say to that man down here, whatever I agree to, whatever I promise you, don't believe a word of it, because I'll be lying to buy us time. You understand? You stay inside, you stay out of sight, and you let me handle Victor Harrington." Clara didn't move. "Clara, go." "He can't see me," Clara said slowly, and her voice had gone strange thick, and Caleb glanced at her sharp. "If he sees me, Caleb, he's never actually the rider who came to town, the one asking questions. He described me to Harrington, but Harrington's never. He's only seen me the once on my father's porch 3 weeks ago for maybe 5 minutes. Her hand tightened on Caleb's sleeve. "He doesn't know my face well. Do you understand what that means? He came up here to look at Elias Bennett's daughter and see if she was worth the trouble. He's expecting to see me." She turned to Caleb, and there was something terrible and brilliant kindling behind her eyes. The look of a woman who had just seen, in the middle of the worst moment, a door nobody else could see. "But he doesn't know what I look like well enough to be sure. And I keep your books. And I know that man's whole scheme better than anyone alive except him. And you just said we needed to get inside his affairs. No." Caleb's voice came out flat and hard as a slammed door. "Whatever you're about to say, no. You don't even know what I'm going to—" "I know exactly what you're going to say because I'm starting to know how your mind works, and the answer is no." He took her by the shoulders again, and this time it wasn't gentle. "You are not going anywhere near that man. Do you hear me? That is the one thing I will not do. I married you to be a wall between you and Victor Harrington, and I'll be damned to every hell there is before I stand here and let you walk toward him. Now go inside. Please, Clara." And the please cracked something in his voice, and she heard it, and it stopped her cold. "Please, go inside." The 3 riders were halfway up the trace now, close enough that the man in the pale coat had lifted a gloved hand, not a wave. Nothing so friendly as a wave, just a small, idle gesture. The gesture of a man announcing himself to a place he already considers his own. And carried up the mountain on the still summer air, thin but clear, came a voice smooth, unhurried, almost warm, calling out across the last 100 yards of the climb. "Mr. Whitaker, I do hope I'm not calling it a bad time. I've come such a long way, and I would so very much like to meet your lovely new wife." Clara's hand went cold as ice in Caleb's, and Caleb Whitaker stepped in front of her, square between his wife and the man climbing his mountain, and reached back to push her toward the door, and found she had already let go of his hand and was already moving, and it was not toward the door at all. She was moving toward the paddock. Caleb caught her arm before she'd taken 3 steps. "Clara, I'm not walking toward him," she said fast low, her eyes never leaving the rider's. "I heard you. I heard the pleas. I'm not doing that." She twisted her arm not to break free but to point. "Elias, the roan. Get him behind the barn now before Harrington's close enough to see him clear. Because that horse is worth $300, and Harrington's the kind of man who counts a house's worth the second he rides into the yard, and I don't want him counting. I don't want him knowing what we've got. Let him think we're poor. Let him think this whole place is worth less than my father's debt. Men like him lowball everything they mean to steal, so let's help him do it." Caleb looked at her for 1/2 second, and understood that she was right, and that she'd seen it faster than he had, and that his wife's mind ran at a speed that both frightened and steadied him. "Barn," he said. Fast. Then inside. She went. She had the roan by the halter and around the back of the barn in under a minute, moving quiet and easy, so the horse stayed calm, and then she slipped in through the barn's side door instead of the cabin's, and Caleb understood that too. She wanted an angle. She wanted to be somewhere she could see, and not be seen somewhere with a door at her back. She'd walked 40 miles from a man who wanted to own her, and she had learned hard never again to stand in an open doorway. By the time Victor Harrington reined up in the yard, Caleb Whitaker was standing alone in front of his cabin with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his face arranged into the flat patient, nothing he'd spent 11 years perfecting. Harrington was older than Caleb had pictured, and softer and more dangerous for it. 55 if he was a day silver at the temples, a face gone comfortable with its own authority. He sat his fine horse and looked around the yard, and Caleb watched him do exactly what Clara had said he'd do. Watched his eyes go from the cabin to the paddock, to the wagon to the woodpile, adding appraising pricing, the whole life out in a single sweep, and finding it. His expression said a small and shabby thing. "Mr. Whitaker." Harrington didn't get down. "You're a hard man to reach. I don't believe I've ever climbed a longer hill." "You found the top all right." "I did." A thin smile. The 2 men behind him hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, sat their horses a few lengths back with the particular stillness of men who were paid to be still until they were paid to stop. "I've come about my letter. I trust you received it." "I did. And I read it." Caleb didn't move from where he stood. Twice. Harrington waited, and when nothing more came, the thin smile thinned further. "Mr. Whitaker, I've ridden a long way, and I'm a busy man, so let me be direct since directness seems to be your only setting. Your wife's father died owing me $1,100. That's a considerable sum. The debt is legal documented, and now that you've married the estate, it is your debt as much as it was ever hers. I'm not an unreasonable man. I didn't come up here to ruin you. I came up here to be paid." He folded his gloved hands on the saddle horn. "Now, you don't strike me as a man with $1,100, so I've come to offer you terms, and I'd suggest you listen to them carefully because they're a good deal kinder than what a court would hand you." "I'm listening." "Sign this place over to me," Harrington said pleasantly. "The land, the water, the stock, all of it. I'll clear the debt in full, and I'll pay you $200 besides cash today to start fresh somewhere else. You and your bride ride off with money in your pocket, and no debt on your name. That's a better deal, Mr. Whitaker, than a great many men in your position have ever been offered." "That's generous." He let it sit. "Or you can refuse me, and I'll take you to court, and I'll win, because I always win, and you'll lose the whole place and get nothing for it, and your wife will learn that her new husband is a fool. Those are the 2 roads. I'd think hard about which one you want to walk." Inside the barn in the dark, Clara stood with her hand pressed flat over her own mouth so no sound would escape her, and she felt the rage come up in her like river water in spring, because $1,100 was a lie. Her father had never owed but $400. She'd seen the note herself. She'd held it in her own hands, and Harrington had padded it near threefold because he could, because a dead man couldn't argue, and a grieving daughter couldn't afford a lawyer, and he'd invented the difference out of pure appetite. She wanted to walk out into that yard and say so. She wanted to scream the true number in his soft, appraising face. She didn't. She stood in the dark, and she breathed, and she made herself do the thing that was harder than screaming, which was to remember to fix the false number in her mind. 1100 against the true 4. Because a lie that big, put in a man's own mouth in front of a witness, was one more brick she could someday build into a wall around his neck. Out in the yard, Caleb was quiet a long moment. 1100, he said. 1100. That's a lot of doctoring for one dying man. Something flickered across Harrington's face, quick gone, and Caleb saw it and filed it away. Medicine's expensive, Harrington said smoothly. And there was interest. A debt accrues, Mr. Whitaker. That's the nature of a debt. I reckon it does. Caleb tilted his head. You got the note on you, the paper her father signed. I'd like to see the figure in his own hand before I sign my whole life away on your say-so. Seems only fair. The flicker again, longer this time. The documents are in my office, Harrington said. Secure. I don't carry sensitive papers up mountains. But you're welcome to view them, of course, at my house where they're kept whenever you like. And there it was. Clara in the dark closed her eyes. He doesn't have it, or he had it, and the figure on it said 400, not 11, and he couldn't show it without showing the lie. Either way, the great Victor Harrington had just told a man he was trying to rob that the proof of the debt lived safely inside his own house, and had done it to sound reasonable, never once imagining that the woman he'd come to collect was standing 30 feet away, cataloging every word, already picturing the inside of that office. Caleb heard it too. Caleb heard everything. But his face gave away nothing at all. I'll think on your offer, he said. Harrington's patience developed a fine crack. There's nothing to think on, Whitaker. There's a right answer and a ruinous one. Men of sense don't think about which is which. I'm not a man of sense, Caleb said. Ask anybody in that town down there. They'll tell you I'm a fool who lives alone up a mountain and talks to nobody. So I'll think on it slow the way a fool does, and I'll ride down and give you my answer inside the week. That's the best I've got for you today. He unhooked one thumb from his belt, slow and easy, and let his hand hang loose and open at his side. Not a threat, nothing you could point to, just a man's hand hanging ready, and something in the small, deliberate ease of it made both of the silent riders behind Harrington sit up a half-inch straighter. Now, you've said your piece and I've heard it. It's a long way back down. You'll want the light. For a moment, nobody moved. Harrington looked at Caleb. Whitaker really looked at him, perhaps for the first time, past the shabby yard, and the poor man's woodpile, and something recalibrated behind his comfortable eyes. He had come up the mountain, expecting to find a frightened homesteader who'd cave at the sight of him. He had met that man 100 times. He knew exactly how that man behaved, how his voice climbed, how his eyes darted to his own house where his own woman was hiding. And this was not that man. This man stood in his yard, with his hand hanging open and easy, and looked back at Victor Harrington like a man looking at weather. It unsettled him, and Harrington, being the man he was, covered the unsettlement the only way he knew, by reaching for cruelty. Your wife, he said, casual, gathering his reins. Is she about? I confess I'm curious. I knew her father a little. I'd like to pay my respects to the man's daughter. His eyes drifted slow and deliberate from the cabin to the barn and back, and Caleb felt the hair rise on his arms, because it was not an idle glance. It was a probe the man was fishing to see where Caleb's eyes would jump. A pretty thing, I'm told. It'd be a shame to come all this way and not lay eyes on the bride. Caleb did not let his eyes go to the barn. It cost him something. It cost him more than Harrington could have known, because every animal instinct in him wanted to look to check to put his eyes on Clara the way a man's eyes go to the thing he's protecting. He held them on Harrington's face instead, dead level, and he let a beat of silence go by, and then another long enough that it started to feel like its own kind of insult. She's resting, Caleb said finally. She had a long trip up here herself not so long ago. You understand? And then quiet flat with just enough underneath it. And I'll ask you not to speak of my wife again, Mr. Harrington. Not her looks, and not her father, and not whether she's about. She's not part of our business. You said it yourself, the debt descends to the estate, and that's a matter of money between two men. So we'll keep it to money, and to men." He held the older man's eyes. "You take my meaning." The yard went very still. The two silent riders were watching their employer, now waiting to see how he'd take it. And Harrington knew they were watching, and Caleb knew he knew, and the whole thing balanced for a moment on a knife's edge. Because a man like Harrington could not afford in front of his own hired guns to be spoken to like that and simply swallow it. And then Victor Harrington smiled. And it was worse than anger. "You know," he said almost warmly, "I like you, Mr. Whitaker. I do. You've got backbone. It's rare." He turned his fine horse's head unhurried. "I'll give you your week since you want it so badly. A man's entitled to a little time to make peace with the inevitable." He walked the horse a few steps toward the trace, then paused and looked back, and the warmth was still on his face, and it made the words 100 times colder. "But I'll tell you something for free, because I've taken a liking to you. A ranch this high up this far from anyone, it's a lonely, dangerous kind of place. Accidents happen up here, fires, a dry summer like this one, a single spark, a whole season's feed gone in an hour. Water goes bad, stock wanders off and never comes home. Terrible things, and no neighbors close enough to hear a man call for help." He gathered his reins. A wise man in a place like this doesn't make enemies. He finds the safe road, and he takes it. For his own sake. A pause, and his wife's. Caleb didn't move, didn't blink. "Ride safe down that hill, Mr. Harrington," he said. "It's a long way to fall." Harrington laughed short and genuine, as if Caleb had told a fine joke, and put his heels to his horse, and the three of them went back down the trace at the same idle, insulting, unhurried pace they'd come up. Caleb stood in his yard and watched them all the way down. Watched until they were 3 dots on the valley road, and then no dots at all, and only then did he let his shoulders come down. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding for the better part of 10 minutes. Clara came out of the barn. She didn't run to him. She walked slow, and her face was white and set, and when she reached him she didn't speak right away. She just stood beside him and looked down the empty trace where the 3 riders had gone. $1,100, she said finally. And her voice shook not with fear, Caleb realized, but with a fury so cold it had gone quiet. "My father owed him 400. I saw the note, Caleb. I held it in my hands the day he signed it. $400, and it near killed him to sign for that. And that man just sat on his fine horse in your yard and called it 11 to your face like the number was his to make up." Her hands had closed into fists at her sides. "He invented $700 out of thin air because he could. Because a dead man can't argue, and he thought I couldn't either. I know. You know, I knew he was lying about something the second the number came out of his mouth." Caleb finally looked at her. "You don't doctor a man to death for $1,100 in this country. Nobody's got that much doctor. I didn't know the true figure, but I knew that one was cooked. And then I asked to see the note. And he couldn't show it," Clara breathed. "Because the paper says 4. He'd have had to hand you the proof he was lying. He said it's in his office, his house." Caleb's jaw worked. He told a man he's trying to rob exactly where the one piece of paper that could sink him is kept. Because he never once imagined the one person alive who knows the true number was standing in that barn hearing him do it. He shook his head slowly. "He's not as smart as he thinks, Clara. He's just never had to be. There's a difference, and it's going to cost him." Clara was quiet a moment. Then low, "He threatened us. At the end. The fire, the water that he threatened to burn us out and poison the spring, and he smiled while he did it. He threatened me, Caleb. And his wife. He said it like, I heard him." Caleb's voice had gone flat and dangerous. "I heard every word of it. He'll do it. You know he will. He didn't ride up here to give us a week out of kindness. He gave us a week because he wants us to sit up here and stew and get scared and fold on our own, so he doesn't have to spend the money and the risk of doing it the hard way." Caleb nodded. "The week's not mercy. The week's a rope. He's giving us enough rope to hang ourselves with our own fear. He figures we'll spend 7 nights up here jumping at every sound, and by the end of it we'll ride down and sign anything he puts in front of us just to make the fear stop. He turned to her. That's the plan. Scare us soft, and let us do the rest ourselves. Then we can't wait. Clara's chin came up. We can't give him the 7 nights. If we sit up here waiting for him to burn us out, he's already won, because either he burns us out or we crack. We have to move first. We have to be down his mountain before he's done up ours. You said that yourself before he ever got here. I did. Caleb looked down the trace one more time. Trouble is, before we needed a plan. Now we need a plan, and we need it inside a week, and we need it to be good enough to beat a man who owns the judges. And we can't so much as make a wrong step in that valley without word getting back to him inside a day, because half the men down there are on his payroll and the other half are too scared to sneeze without his say-so. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. We need somebody down there, somebody who hates him, somebody with nothing left for him to take. And Clara went very still. I might know somebody, she said slowly. Caleb looked at her. There was a family, Clara said, in the valley, before my father got sick. The Reyes family. They ran sheep on a piece of ground up against the river. Good ground, the best water in the whole valley besides Harrington's own. Her voice had gone quiet and careful. The voice of a person walking back into a bad memory, one step at a time. And Harrington wanted it. Of course he wanted it. It had water. So he did to them what he's trying to do to us. He found a debt or made one, I never knew which, and he dressed it up in the law, and he took them to his judge, and the judge did what Harrington's judge always does, and inside a season, the Reyes family didn't have a piece of ground to stand on. Old man Reyes had worked that land 30 years. His father before him. Gone, just gone, on a piece of paper. She swallowed. And then the son, Tomas. Tomas Reyes stood up in that courtroom and called Harrington a thief to his face in front of the judge and the whole town, and named every dirty thing his family knew about him. And you know what happened? Nothing happened, Caleb said quietly, because the man he was accusing owned the room. Nothing happened. The judge told him to sit down or be jailed for contempt. And 2 weeks later the Reyes barn burned to the ground with their whole flock inside it, and the sheriff, Harrington's sheriff, ruled it an accident. Dry summer. A spark. Clara's eyes came up to Caleb's, and there was a terrible understanding in them. The same story. The exact same story Harrington just stood in your yard and told you. Word for word. A dry summer. A spark. He's not even inventing new threats, Caleb. He's reading us the last man's obituary. The two of them stood in the yard with that hanging between them. Where's the son now? Caleb said. This Tomas Reyes. I don't know for certain, but there was talk before I left that he'd taken work at a freight yard on the edge of the valley, the far edge of the county line, as far from Harrington's land as a man could get, and still be close enough to watch it. Talk was he wouldn't leave. Couldn't. Just stayed out there at the county line, hauling other men's freight and watching the valley he lost. Clara's jaw tightened. A man like that, Caleb. A man who lost everything to Harrington and stayed close enough to hate him properly every single day. If anyone in that valley knows where the bodies are buried, it's the man who watched Harrington bury them. Caleb was already turning toward the barn, already moving the stillness of the last hour, breaking all at once into purpose. Then that's where we start. Not with the judge, not with the town, not with anybody who's got something left to lose. We start with the one man down there who's already lost it all because a man with nothing left to take is the only kind of man Harrington can't touch. He stopped and turned back. But Clara, if we do this, we do it careful, and we do it fast, and we do it knowing that the second Harrington gets wind, we're not sitting up here shaking like he wants the week's over. The gloves come off. He won't wait for the fire to be accidental anymore. You understand what I'm saying? The minute we move, we're in it. All the way. No going back to a quiet ranch and a debt we could have just paid. Clara looked at him, and Caleb watched her think about it, Really think the way she thought about everything, weighing it, turning it over. And he loved that about her, and had not yet let himself know that he loved it. And then she did a thing that stopped his breath. She stepped forward, and she put her hand flat against his chest over the letter over his heart, and she said, "There was never any going back. There hasn't been since the morning you said 'I do' to that ceiling. You knew that. I knew that. Harrington just made it plain." She looked up at him. "So let's stop being the two people waiting at the top of the mountain for the fire. Let's go be the fire." And Caleb Whitaker, who had spent 11 years making himself into a man with nothing to lose, discovered in that moment that he had somehow acquired everything worth losing all at once, standing right in front of him with her hand on his heart, and that instead of the terror he'd braced for his whole solitary life, what he felt was something closer to being unburied. They rode out before first light the next morning. Not down the main trace, Caleb wouldn't hear of it, because the main trace ran past 3 homesteads that owed money to Harrington's bank, and any one of them might send a boy down the mountain for the price of a dropped debt. They went the back way, the high trail Clara had learned in the dark, and it added 2 hours, and it was worth every minute, because it put them onto the county road east of the valley, without ever crossing into it, coming at the freight yard from the outside, like 2 travelers passing through. Rather than 2 people, the richest man in 3 counties was hunting. The freight yard sat in the flat dust of the county line, a sprawl of loading docks and pens, and a low office busy even at that early hour with the shouts of teamsters and the groan of loaded wagons. Caleb reined up at the edge of it and sat his horse a moment, watching the way he watched everything, learning the shape of the place before he stepped into it. "You don't ask for him by name," Caleb said low. "Not right off. A man asks for Tomas Reyes by name at a freight yard on Harrington's border, word could travel. We go slow. We find him ourselves." But they didn't have to find him, because a man was already walking toward them across the yard, a lean, hard-used man in his early 30s with a teamster's shoulders and a teamster's ruined hands, and a face that had learned some years back to stop expecting anything good, and he'd stopped dead about 40 feet off, and he was staring at Clara like he'd seen a ghost walk up out of the ground. "I know you," the man said. His voice came out strange cracked. You're Elias Bennett's girl." He took a step closer, and another, and his ruined hands had started to shake at his sides. "You're Clara Bennett. Your daddy trained my uncle's mare years back. You were just a kid. You used to sit on the corral fence and—" He stopped. His throat worked. "I heard your daddy passed. I'm sorry for it. He was a decent man. There wasn't many decent men in that valley, and Harrington ran off or buried most of the ones there were." His eyes moved to Caleb wary, and then back to Clara, and something desperate and hungry came into them. "Why are you here? Why would Elias Bennett's girl come all the way out to the county line to a freight yard? There's only one reason anybody comes out here to find me." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "You've got trouble with Harrington, don't you?" Clara looked at Tomas Reyes, at the ruined hands, the watching eyes, the whole shape of a man who'd lost everything and stayed close enough to grieve it every single day, and she understood that she was looking at what she might have become. What her father had spent his dying breath and Caleb's whole life trying to keep her from becoming. "He says my father owed him $1,100, she said quietly. "He rode up my husband's mountain yesterday and offered to take the whole ranch to settle it. And when my husband didn't fold fast enough, he stood in the yard and talked about a dry summer. And a spark." She held the man's eyes. "He read us your family's story, Mr. Reyes, word for word, like a man who's told it 100 times and expects it to work the 101st. Something moved across Tomas Reyes's face, grief and rage, and something older and more dangerous than both, something that had been banked for years like a fire under ash and had just in a single sentence been given air. He looked back over his shoulder, quick at the busy yard, at the teamsters and the docks, at all the ears a man couldn't trust. Then he looked back at them, and his voice came out very low and very fast. "Not here," Tomas Reyes said. "There's ears in this yard that carry to that man's house by nightfall. You come with me. There's a shed out back where they store the busted axles. Nobody goes near it." He was already turning, already moving, and over his shoulder, quiet, terrible, came the thing that changed everything. Because I'll tell you what I never told that judge. What I couldn't prove back then with my barn full of dead sheep and my family gone and not one soul in that whole valley brave enough to stand with me. He stopped at the shed door and his hand was on the latch and his knuckles had gone white on it. And when he turned back, his eyes were wet and blazing all at once. The debt Harrington took our land for, the note my father supposedly signed. His voice cracked clean in half. My father couldn't write his name. Couldn't read a word of English his whole life. Never signed a paper in 30 years. My mother signed everything. Always everybody in that valley knew it. He pushed the shed door open into the dark. So whoever signed Ernesto Reyes on that note that stole my family's land, it wasn't my father. It was a forgery. And I think I have thought every single day for 4 years that the man who forged it is the same man who's coming for you. The shed door closed behind them, and in the closed dark, Tomas Reyes told them the rest of it fast in a low rush, like a man emptying a wound that had been closed too long. My mother kept everything, he said. Every paper my father ever put his mark to, she signed for him always, and she wrote the date, and she wrote what it was for in her own hand in a little book she kept. 30 years of it. Every debt, every sale, every deal. Because she couldn't read English, but she could read numbers, and she never once trusted a man in that valley to remember a bargain honest. His voice shook. When Harrington came for the land, I told the judge, I said, my father never signed that note. He can't sign, ask anybody. And the judge said, then who's this signature? And I had nothing because I didn't have the book yet. My mother had it hid, and she was too scared to bring it out with Harrington's men standing in the back of that courtroom. And by the time I got it, the land was gone, and the barn had burned, and my mother... He stopped hard. My mother passed that winter. Grief, the doctor said. I say, Harrington, same thing in the end. You still have it, Clara said. Not a question. She'd gone very still. The book. Your mother's book. You still have it. 4 years I've kept it. Tomas's ruined hands opened and closed. 4 years I've sat out here on the county line with the one thing that proves that man's a forger and a thief, and no way on God's earth to use it. Because who do I take it to? The sheriff's his. The judge is his. The bank's his. A man like me walks into any office in this valley waving a dead woman's account book, and I don't walk back out. His eyes found Clara's in the gloom, then Caleb's. I've had that book 4 years, like a loaded gun with no one to point it at. And now, Elias Bennett's girl walks into my yard with the same story starting all over again. His voice dropped. Maybe that's why I kept it. Maybe I was keeping it for this. Caleb had been quiet, letting the man talk, letting Clara draw it out of him. But now he stepped forward, and when he spoke it was slow and careful, a man testing ice. That book proves he forged a signature 4 years ago, Caleb said. It proves he's a thief. But a thief in this valley in front of his own judge, you said it yourself. It's not enough. He'll say the book's a forgery. He'll say you wrote it last week out of spite. One dead woman's ledger against the richest man in 3 counties. He shook his head. It's a stick of dynamite, Mr. Reyes, but we've got no way to light it. Not down here. His courtroom, his rules. Then we don't light it in his courtroom, Clara said. Both men looked at her. She'd gone somewhere behind her eyes, the same place Caleb had watched her go the day she caught his feedman robbing him, the place where the bookkeeper lived, the part of her that didn't just add, but found. Listen to me. Listen to what we've got laid out plain, because I've been building it in my head since yesterday, and it's bigger than any one of us has been seeing it. She held up one finger. We've got a forged note that stole the Reyes land 4 years old cold, but proof of the method. Proof this is how he works. A second finger. We've got a debt against my father that Harrington swears is $1,100 when the real note, the note in his own office that he told my husband is sitting right there in his house, says 4. That's a fresh crime. That's this year. That's him inflating a debt near threefold to steal a second family's land the exact same way he stole the first. A third finger, and her voice had picked up speed, picked up heat. And we've got a pattern, Mr. Reyes. 2 families. The same forged paper method 4 years apart. That's not a grudge, and it's not a coincidence. That's a scheme. That's a man who's built his whole fortune stealing land with faked paper, and if he did it to you and he's doing it to us, then he's done it to others. There are more. There have to be more. 4 years between the two we know about. How many are in between? How many families in this valley signed papers they couldn't read for debts that weren't real to a man who owns the judge? The shed had gone dead silent. You're talking about all of them, Tomas said slowly. Every family he ever ran off. You're talking about... I'm talking about the bank. Clara's eyes were burning now. It all runs through his bank, doesn't it? Every debt, every note, every foreclosure. It's his bank that holds the paper, and a bank keeps records. Mr. Reyes, a bank has to keep records. It's the law. Even a crooked one keeps 2 sets, the real numbers and the ones he shows. Because a man that greedy can't help himself. He has to know down to the dollar exactly how much he's stolen. It'll be written down somewhere in that house. The true figures, the real notes, everything. She turned to Caleb. He told you himself. The proof lives in his office, his house. He said it to your face because he never dreamed I'd hear it. You want to get into Victor Harrington's house, Caleb said flatly. You want to walk into the home of the man who threatened to burn us alive and go through his private papers. I want to find the second set of books, Clara said. Because a forged note and a dead woman's ledger, that's 2 families' word against a rich man. But his own records in his own hand, showing the true debts against the false ones he collected. That's not our word anymore, Caleb. That's his. That's a confession he wrote himself $1 at a time because he couldn't stop himself from counting his own theft. Her jaw set. And you don't take that to his judge. You take it clean out of his reach. You take it to a federal court. Land fraud across a whole valley, forged signatures, a scheme running 4 years and more. That's not a local matter for a bought sheriff. That's the kind of thing brings a circuit judge down from the territorial capital who never once sat at Victor Harrington's table and doesn't give a damn how many badges he owns. Nobody spoke. Then Tomas Reyes let out a breath that shook at the end of it, and he said low, You're Elias Bennett's girl, all right. He had that same look when he found something in a set of books that wasn't supposed to be there. He wiped a hand across his mouth. But you're talking about getting into that house. And that house is a fortress. He's got men on it day and night and dogs, and after what happened to my family, he's careful he doesn't leave papers where a hand can stumble on them. You'd need to know the house. You'd need to know which room, which desk, which drawer, and you'd need to do it while he's not standing over it. He shook his head. I don't know the inside of that house. I hauled freight to the gate, never past it. There's not a soul who's crossed Harrington and lived who's ever been inside those walls. And that was when Clara went still in a different way. There is one, she said quietly. Caleb looked at her sharp. Clara, there's the housekeeper. She said it slow, dragging it up out of memory. There was a woman, Ruth, I think Ruth something, she kept house for Harrington for years. My father did work for the estate a few times before the sickness, and she was always kind to me. Slipped me bread from the kitchen. Told me once I was a girl. I hardly understood it. She told me she stayed on because she had nowhere else and a daughter to feed, but she said it like a woman confessing a sin. Clara's brow furrowed. She hated him. I remember that clear, even as a child, the way she'd go quiet and hard when his name came up. She stayed because she had to, not because she wanted to. And if she's still in that house, you don't know that she is, Caleb said. And if she is, you don't know she'd help you. A woman with a daughter to feed doesn't cross Victor Harrington on the say-so of a girl she gave bread to 10 years back. You'd be putting your life in the hands of a stranger who's got every reason to sell you to keep her place. I know. Clara did not flinch from it. I know exactly what I'd be doing. But Caleb, every road here runs through that house. There's no version of this where we win from the outside. He owns the outside. The town, the law, the whole valley, it's all his. We can't beat him on ground he owns. The only place he's weak is inside his own walls, where he's so sure of himself he wrote his crimes down and hired a woman he never once imagined might hate him enough to help us. She spread her hands. We don't have a week. We've got maybe 5 days now, maybe less, and no way in but the one door nobody's ever thought to knock on. So yes, I'm going to find Ruth. I'm going to find out if she's still in that house, and I'm going to find out if 10 years of his cruelty made her into somebody who'll open a door for us. And if it did, and if it didn't, Caleb said, she tells Harrington that Elias Bennett's daughter is asking questions about the inside of his house, and he stops giving us a week, and he stops making the fire look like an accident. His voice had gone rough. You'd be betting our whole lives on a memory of a woman who gave you bread when you were small. Yes? Clara said simply. I would, because it's the only bet on the table, and I'd rather make a hard bet standing up than a safe one on my knees. She stepped close to him and lowered her voice so it was just for him, even in the little shed. You married me to be my wall, Caleb, and you've been a good one, better than I had any right to ask for. But a wall that only ever holds still and takes the blows, it comes down in the end. Every wall does. The only wall that lasts is the one that fights back. She looked up at him. Let me fight back. Just this once. Let me be more than the thing you're protecting. And Caleb Whitaker, looking down into his wife's face in the dim of a freight shed, felt the war go on inside him, the 11-year-old law of a man who wanted nothing, so he could lose nothing against the new and terrible thing that had grown in his chest since a woman walked up his mountain with a dead man's letter. Every instinct he had screamed to say no to, put himself between her and that house to be the wall, and take the blows and keep her safe behind him where the world couldn't reach. But he looked at her, and he understood the way she'd made him understand so many things without ever quite saying them, that keeping her safe behind him would be its own kind of losing her. That the woman he'd married didn't want to be kept. That she'd walked 40 miles precisely so she'd never again be a thing that men decided the fate of while she waited in another room. All right, he said, and the word cost him more than the ranch, more than the debt, more than anything Harrington could take. All right, but not alone, never alone. Wherever you go in that valley, I'm 40 feet behind you with a rifle, and Tomas. He looked at the freight man. Tomas knows the valley, and the valley knows Tomas, and a freight wagon can go anywhere without a soul thinking twice. We do it together, all three, or we don't do it at all. Those are my terms this time. He held her eyes. You gave me terms at the start. Now here's mine. You don't walk into anything alone. Not ever. Not even a kitchen door. Because I have spent 11 years with nothing to lose, Clara. And I will not go back to it. You hear me? Whatever this is between us, whatever we said it was, and whatever it's turned into, I am not losing it in that man's house. So you take the risk. But you take me with it. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and something passed over her face. Something soft and startled, as though she'd heard underneath the words the thing he still couldn't say straight out. Together, she said. Together, said Tomas Reyes from the shadows, and put out one ruined hand, and the three of them stood in the dark of that shed with their hands stacked one on the other like men swearing an oath in an old story. 3 people the richest man in the valley had ruined or meant to. And for the first time in 4 years, Tomas Reyes did not look like a man watching a valley he'd lost. He looked like a man who'd found something to do about it. They found Ruth 2 days later, and they found her the careful way Tomas put word out through the one channel Harrington didn't own. The freight yard's cook, an old woman who'd known Ruth 30 years, and would sooner die than carry a tale to the big house. The message went kitchen to kitchen, woman to woman, under the notice of every man on Harrington's payroll. Elias Bennett's daughter would speak with you, alone. She remembers the bread. And Ruth came. She came on her afternoon out when the housekeeper was permitted her 1/2 day, and she came to the back of the freight yard, Cook's little house at the county line. And when she stepped into that kitchen and saw Clara Bennett standing there grown, she stopped in the doorway and put one hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled. Look at you, Ruth said, muffled behind her hand. Just look at you, all grown, your father's eyes. She was older than Clara remembered, worn thinner, a woman ground down by years of service in a hard house, but her eyes were sharp, and they were not afraid. They told me you'd married Whitaker up on the mountain. The whole valley's talking of it. And they told me why you married him because the whole valley knows Harrington was going to—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "You got out. You actually got out. There's not been a woman in 20 years got out from under that man's want. I didn't believe it when I heard it." Her voice dropped and it shook. "And now you've come back into his reach. Girl, why would you come back?" "Because he followed me out," Clara said gently. "He's turned my father's debt into a claim on my husband's land. $1,100, he says. Ruth, my father, owed him $4. The old woman's face went hard and old, and knowing all at once, and Clara saw in it the confirmation of everything she'd guessed and more. "4, Ruth said. Flat. Course it was 4, and he'll have written 11 in the book and had that lickspittle judge nod it through, same as ever. She lowered herself into a kitchen chair like her legs had gone and put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. I've watched him do it 11 years. 11 years I've kept that house and served that table and stood in that dining room with a tray in my hands while he laughed with the judge and the sheriff over the families he'd wrecked that week. The Reyes place, the Halloran place, the old widow Pruitt out on the flats. He had her land and her out of her house in a season, and she died in the county poorhouse, and he toasted it, girl. He lifted a glass at his own table over a dead woman's home. Her voice had begun to shake in earnest now. And I stood there, every time. I stood there, and I held the tray, and I said nothing because I've a daughter, and a daughter's got to eat, and there's no other work in this valley he doesn't control. And a woman my age with a girl to raise and no husband, I told myself I had no choice. 11 years I told myself I had no choice. Her eyes came up, and they were wet and blazing the exact same fire Clara had seen kindle in Tomas Reyes. And I was lying. I always had a choice. I just never had anyone ask me to make it. The kitchen had gone still. "I'm asking," Clara said softly. Ruth looked at her a long moment. "You want inside the house," she said. "I want the books, the real ones. He keeps them, doesn't he? The true figures against the false ones he collected. He keeps them." Ruth's mouth twisted. "In the study. Behind the paneling to the left of the fireplace there's a false front. You'd never find it looking. He had a man come out from the Capitol to build it. And then I heard that man had an accident on the road home, so." She let that sit. "A green ledger and a black one. The black one's the one he shows the bank's official book, the one the examiners see once a year over a good dinner. The green one's the truth. Every real debt against every false one. Every name. Every dollar he ever stole." Her hands had closed into fists on the table. "I've dusted that panel 1,000 times. I've stood not 2 feet from it, holding a rag, knowing what was behind it, knowing it could hang him, knowing I'd never in this life have the nerve or the reason to open it." Her voice cracked clean through. "Give me the reason, girl. God help me. I've waited 11 years for somebody to give me the reason." Clara reached across the table and took the old woman's fists in both her hands. "Thursday," Ruth said, before Clara could speak the words coming fast. Now a woman who'd made her decision and meant to spend it all at once, before her nerve could fail. "Thursday night. He rides to the county seat every Thursday to dine with the judge and play cards till the small hours takes the sheriff and 2 of his men gone from 6 till near 2 in the morning. The house is near empty Thursday nights, just me and the girl who does the scullery, and one man at the gate who's half drunk by 9 because he thinks nobody's watching. Thursday night's the only night in the week that study sits empty with the master gone." She gripped Clara's hands back hard. "You come Thursday. I'll leave the kitchen door off the latch. I'll have the scullery girl sent home to her mother sick. I'll put something in her tea. Nothing bad. She'll just want her bed. And I'll show you the panel myself." Her chin came up. "And if it costs me my place, and my daughter's bread, and everything I've spent 11 years being a coward to keep, then it costs me. I'm done holding the tray." Clara's throat had closed. "Ruth." "Don't," the old woman said, and there was something almost like peace breaking over her worn face. "Don't thank me. You don't understand. You're not asking me to do a brave thing. You're freeing me from a cowardly one. 11 years, girl. You've no idea the weight of standing by. It's heavier than any brave thing a person ever did." She pressed Clara's hands once more and let them go. Thursday. After dark. The kitchen door. They rode back up the mountain that night in a silence thick with everything that was about to happen, and it was only when the cabin came in sight dark against the darker slope that Clara finally spoke. "She's staked her whole life on us," she said. "Her and her daughter both. If this goes wrong Thursday, it's not just us that Harrington." "I know it. Then it has to go right." Clara's voice was very quiet. "It can't just mostly work. Ruth can't spend her daughter's whole future on a plan that mostly works. It won't be mostly." Caleb reined up in the yard and sat his horse a moment, looking at the dark shape of the home he'd built and might lose. "You'll go in the kitchen door. You'll find the panel. You'll take the green book, the green one, not the black. You heard her, and you'll be out and gone before that man's finished his second hand of cards. Tomas'll have the freight wagon at the county road with a false bottom in it, and that book rides out of this valley under a load of axles where no man of Harrington's would ever think to look. And I'll be 40 feet from that kitchen door the whole time with a rifle across my knees, and if anything goes wrong, you come out that door running and you don't look back, because I will make certain nobody follows you." He turned to look at her in the dark. "It'll go right, Clara, because we've thought it through every way a thing can go wrong, and that's the only way a dangerous thing ever goes right. You scare yourself with every version of it, failing until you've closed every door but the one that works." Clara was quiet a moment. "You've changed," she said softly, "since I walked up this mountain. Do you know that the man who opened that door to me 3 weeks ago would never have planned a thing like this? He'd have paid the debt or sent me off with a horse and gone back to his quiet. He didn't have anything he was willing to fight this hard for." Caleb didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "He didn't." And in the dark he reached across the space between their horses and found her hand, and this time he didn't grip it once and let it go the way he had before, the practical way, the way a man steadies a thing. This time he held it, just held it. Her cold fingers in his rough ones, and neither of them said a word, and neither of them let go, and the thing that had been growing between them since the morning he said, "I do," to a ceiling, sat there in the dark, unspoken and enormous, and no longer possible to pretend away. "Whatever happens Thursday," Caleb said at last. Low, rough-looking, straight ahead into the dark, and not at her because he couldn't say it looking at her. "I need you to know something. When I married you, I told you it was a business, a cold offer. I told you not to go getting notions that time might turn it into something." He swallowed. "That was true when I said it. I want you to know I wasn't lying to you. It was true that morning." Clara had gone very still, her hand motionless in his. "And it isn't true anymore," Caleb said. The night held its breath. "I know," Clara whispered. "I know it isn't. It stopped being true for me somewhere around the day you named that horse Elias, and thought I didn't understand why." Her fingers tightened around his. "I've known for a while. I've just been afraid to say it because the last time I let myself need something, I lost everything same as you. And I didn't want to walk up here and hang my heart around your neck on top of my father's debt. It seemed like too much to ask of a man who only ever promised me a wall." "You didn't ask," Caleb said. "That's the thing about you, Clara. You never once asked me for the thing you actually needed. You asked for a wall, and you'd have made do with a wall your whole life, and never said a word." He turned to her at last in the dark. "But I'm not a wall. I found that out somewhere on this mountain, watching you gentle a horse nobody could touch and catch a thief I'd fed for 10 years, and stand in a barn, keeping count of a rich man's lies, while he threatened to burn us both. I'm not a wall, Clara. A wall doesn't love the thing it's protecting. His voice broke on it, the word he'd sworn 11 years ago he'd never say again. "And I do. God help me, I do." For a long moment, there was nothing in the whole dark world but the two of them, and the horses breathing, and the cabin waiting. And then Clara Bennett leaned across the space between them and kissed her husband for the first time, 3 weeks married. And Caleb Whitaker, who had made himself into a man with nothing to lose, felt the last stone of his fortress come down for good, and found on the other side of it, not the ruin he'd spent 11 years dreading, but a woman who had walked 40 miles to reach him and had somehow, without either of them meaning it, reached all the way in. Thursday came, the way a held breath finally lets go. They rode down in the last of the light, the three of them. Tomas's freight wagon groaning under a load of busted axles with a false bottom built into it, and Clara in a plain dark dress that wouldn't show against the night, and Caleb with 2 rifles and a face like carved stone. They left the wagon at the county road, with Tomas and Caleb and Clara, went the last half-mile on foot, through the dark, toward the great house where every window was black, except the servant's lamp burning low in the kitchen. The signal, Ruth's signal, the door is off the latch, and the master is gone. At the edge of the yard, Caleb caught Clara's arm one last time. "Green Book," he said, barely a breath. "You're in and out. If you hear me whistle one long note, you drop everything and you run for the county road and you don't stop. Promise me." "I promise." Clara. His hand tightened. Everything he'd said in the dark 2 nights back was in it. "Come back to me." "I always come back," she said. "I walked 40 miles to find you. A rich man's kitchen door isn't going to stop me now." And she kissed him once, quick and fierce, and slipped away across the dark yard, toward the low burning lamp, and Caleb Whitaker settled into the black shadow of the garden wall, with a rifle across his knees, and his whole newfound heart walking away from him, toward the house of the man who'd sworn to burn them. And he watched the kitchen door open a crack of gold, and watched his wife slip through it, and watched it close. And for a long, long moment, there was nothing, and then from the black road behind him, faint but unmistakable on the still night air, Caleb Whitaker heard the sound that turned his blood to ice, the sound of many horses coming fast, coming from the county seat, coming home hours early, and a voice he knew smooth and unhurried, even at the gallop, calling out to the men riding hard beside him. "Faster, gentlemen! I've a feeling we've got guests tonight." Caleb was up and moving before the thought finished forming. He didn't whistle. That was the first decision made in a half-second, and it was the hardest one of his life, because a whistle would bring Clara running out the kitchen door straight into a yard about to fill with Harrington's riders, and better she stay hidden in that house another minute than run into open ground with nowhere to go. So he swallowed the whistle, and he ran low along the garden wall, toward the gate, toward the sound of the horses, and his mind ran faster than his legs. They're coming to the front gate, the drive, and Clara's at the kitchen, the back. If I can pull them to the front. Hold their eyes at the front, she can still come out the back and make the road. He needed them looking at him. So Caleb Whitaker did the last thing on earth a careful man does. He stepped out of the shadow of the wall into the open drive square in the path of 6 riders coming home at a gallop, and he raised his rifle to his shoulder and put a bullet over their heads into the dark, and he shouted in a voice that carried across the whole dark valley, "That's far enough, Harrington!" The riders hauled up in a chaos of dust and screaming horses, and for one wild moment, the whole yard was nothing but plunging animals and cursing men, and out of the middle of it came Victor Harrington's voice, and it was not smooth anymore. It had gone tight and high with rage. "Whitaker, Whitaker, on my own land in the dark, do you know what I can do to a man who—" "I know exactly what you can do," Caleb called back, and he'd already moved, already slid 3 steps sideways into new shadow, so the muzzle flash wouldn't have marked him an old soldier's trick, and he heard the men swing their guns toward where he'd been and not where he was. "You can burn a family's barn with their flock inside and call it a dry summer. You can put a dead man's daughter's father in your debt for $400 and swear to a judge it was 11. You can forge an old man's name who never held a pen in his life and steal 30 years of his blood." His voice rang off the walls of the great dark house. "I know exactly what you can do, Harrington. The question is whether you can do it to a man who's already told the whole territory how you do it." That stopped him. Caleb heard it. Stop him. Heard the little silence open up in the middle of Harrington's rage, because the man was quick whatever else he was, and he'd just heard 3 specific facts come out of the dark that no outsider was ever supposed to know. "You're bluffing," Harrington said. But there was a crack in it now. "You know nothing. You're a mountain hermit with a rifle and a dead man's debt, and you've just fired on me on my own." "The Reyes note," Caleb said. Ernesto Reyes, a man who couldn't sign his name in English if you held a gun to his family, and you did near enough. His wife kept a book, Harrington, 30 years of every mark he ever made, and every one she made for him. And that book says he never once in his whole life signed the note you took his land with. He let it land. "You want to call that a bluff? Go ahead. Call it in front of a federal judge. I'll wait." Silence. Total absolute silence in the dark yard. And in that silence, that precious silence, Caleb had bought with a bullet, and 3 names, and his own body standing in the open. The kitchen door at the back of the house opened, soundless. A thin line of gold, and Clara Bennett slipped out into the dark with something heavy held against her chest under her shawl, and behind her came Ruth, and the 2 women went low and fast along the back wall toward the black gap in the garden hedge that led onto the fields. Caleb couldn't see them, but he knew. He'd counted the seconds, and he knew, and every word he threw at Harrington now was a wall of his own body thrown up between that man and the women slipping away behind him. "You've been stealing this valley, one forged signature at a time for years," Caleb called louder now, keeping every eye and every gun pointed at the front. "And you kept score. That's the thing about a man like you, Harrington, you couldn't help it. You had to know the exact number. So you wrote it all down. The real debts and the false ones. Every family. Every dollar." He heard Harrington's breath change, heard it go ragged, and knew he'd struck bone. "It's a green book, behind the panel by your study fireplace. And I'll bet my life you're wishing right now you'd burned it years ago. Get in the house." Harrington's voice cracked like a whip, and it wasn't aimed at Caleb, it was aimed at his men. "The study now, go!" And that was the moment it all came apart for Victor Harrington, though it took him a few seconds more to understand it. Because his men wheeled their horses and pounded for the front door, and the front door was thrown open, and lamps were lit in a rush, and Harrington himself flung out of the saddle and ran into his own house, with the sick certainty of a man who already knows, and Caleb Whitaker faded back into the dark and ran low and fast for the black gap in the hedge where 2 women had gone through a minute before. He caught them at the field's edge. Clara whirled the heavy thing clutched to her chest and nearly cried out before she saw it was him. And then she was against him for one hard second, shaking, and the thing between them under her shawl was a book, and it was green. "I got it," she breathed. "Caleb, I got it, the green one. Ruth showed me the panel and I—" She was talking too fast, the fear and the triumph all tangled up. "And there's more, there's so much more than we thought. I saw the pages. It's everything. It's names I never—" "Later." He had her by the arm, moving her Ruth on the other side. The 3 of them running now through the dark field toward the county road where a freight wagon waited. "He knows it's gone. He'll have the whole valley up inside the hour. We ride now, and we ride hard, and we don't stop till that book's out of his reach. Now, Clara, run." They ran. They reached the wagon, and Tomas had the false bottom open, and the green book went into it under the load of axles, and Ruth went up onto the seat with her whole life left behind her in that house. And Clara and Caleb took to their horses, and the wagon, and the 2 riders went out onto the county road in the dark. Just as behind them, the great house of Victor Harrington erupted into lights and shouting, and the drum of men mounting up to hunt. But they were already gone. And the thing that could hang him was gone with them. And Victor Harrington, standing in his violated study, staring at an open panel and an empty space where a green book had sat for years, understood for the first time in his life that he had lost something he could not buy, steal back, or burn. They didn't take it to the county seat. They didn't take it to the sheriff or the judge or any man within 100 miles of Victor Harrington's table. They took it, the 4 of them, on the hardest ride of Clara's life, clear out of the valley and out of the county and up to the territorial capital where the circuit court sat. A 2-day ride they made in a day and a half, sleeping in shifts. The Green Book never once out of arm's reach, and they laid it down on the desk of a federal marshal who had never dined at Victor Harrington's table and never taken a dollar of his money, and did not, it turned out, care in the slightest how many badges the man owned 3 counties away. It took the marshal one night to read the Green Book. It took him one night, and Clara sat up with him for the whole of it, because she was the only one who could read a ledger the way it needed reading, the only one who could show him how the true figures ran against the false, how the same forger's hand had signed a dozen dead and terrified men's names, how a whole valley's worth of stolen land and ruined families and toasts drunk over dead widows was all there, written down in Victor Harrington's own careful hand, one greedy figure at a time. And by morning the marshal's face had gone gray and hard, and he closed the book and he said, "Ma'am, in 30 years I have never seen a man convict himself so thoroughly. He did our whole job for us. He just couldn't stand not to count it." And he swore out the warrants that same morning. They rode back into the valley 2 weeks later behind a federal marshal and 6 deputies who answered to no one Victor Harrington had ever bought. The valley had never seen anything like it. Word ran ahead of them, the way fire runs through dry grass. They've come for Harrington. Elias Bennett's girl and the mountain man, and the freight yard Reyes and the housekeeper. They've come for Harrington, and they've brought the government with them. And by the time they reached the town, the streets that had gone silent and suspicious when Caleb rode through with a strange woman 3 weeks before were lined with people. Not hostile now, watching, wondering. Half of them owing Harrington money, and all of them afraid of him, and every one of them craning to see whether the impossible thing was really about to happen, whether a man could actually be too big to be brought down, or whether he'd only ever seemed that way because no one had been brave enough to try. Victor Harrington did not go quietly, but he did not go with a fight either in the end, because there was no fight left to make. His bought judge would not so much as come to the door. His sheriff had already been arrested the day before on the strength of the same Green Book, and had already, in the way of such men, begun telling the marshal everything he knew to save his own skin. The men on Harrington's payroll melted away into the hills the moment the federal deputies appeared, because a hired gun works for a man who wins, and everyone in that valley could see all at once that Victor Harrington had stopped winning. They led him out of his great house in irons in the full light of a summer morning, and the whole town watched, and the families he'd ruined watched. Tomas Reyes stood in the front of the crowd with his ruined hands at his sides, and his father's stolen land at his back, and he did not shout, and he did not spit, and he did not need to. He just watched the man who'd burned his barn and buried his family walk past him in chains, and that was enough. That was everything, 4 years of it, and when Harrington's eyes found his in the crowd, it was Harrington who looked away first. And Victor Harrington, passing Clara Bennett on the steps of his own house. Clara, whom he'd once looked over on a dead man's porch and priced like a horse, whom he'd meant to take as a widower's arrangement, whom he'd been so certain was nothing but a debt, with a pretty face, stopped and looked at her. And in his eyes was the pure incomprehension of a man who had never once in his life been beaten, trying to understand how it had happened, and by whom. "You," he said, just that, like an accusation, like a question. "Me," Clara agreed quietly. And she didn't gloat and she didn't rage, though God knew she'd earned the right to both. She just looked at the man who'd made her run 40 miles into the dark, and she said the only thing worth saying. "You should have shown my husband the note, Mr. Harrington. When he asked to see it, that was your whole mistake. You couldn't show him 400, so you told him 11, and the 11 was a lie, and a man who'll build a lie that size in front of a witness." She almost smiled. "Well, he'll have written the truth down somewhere. Men like you always do. You can't help but count what you steal." She stepped back to let the deputies lead him on. "My father used to say there's no such thing as a bad ledger, Mr. Harrington. Only an honest one and a dishonest one, sitting side by side waiting for somebody to lay them next to each other. You kept both. All you needed was somebody who could read." And she turned her back on Victor Harrington and did not watch them take him away, because he was already to her a thing that had happened and was over. The Green Book did more than take one man. That was the thing none of them had fully understood, standing in that freight shed weeks before, that a book which convicted Victor Harrington also freed everyone he'd used it to rob. The federal court, once it had the true figures, went back through every foreclosure, every forged note, every family runoff in the dark of the law. The Reyes land came back to Tomas, not the barn, not his mother, not the years. Those were gone for good, and no court could restore them, but the ground. The 30 years of his father's blood. He walked back onto it on a summer morning and knelt down and put both his ruined hands flat in the dirt and stayed that way a long time, and no one disturbed him. And when he rose, his face was wet, and it was the first time in 4 years anyone had seen Tomas Reyes look like a man who had somewhere to be. Ruth got her freedom and her back wages, both 11 years of a hard house, and the court made Harrington's seized estate pay every dollar of it. And it was enough for a small place of her own, where her daughter would never have to hold a tray in a cruel man's dining room. On the day she moved into it, she came up the mountain to see Clara, and the two women stood in the yard where Caleb had once faced down Victor Harrington, and Ruth took Clara's face in both her worn hands, the way she had 10 years before in a kitchen with a stolen piece of bread. "You asked me to make the choice," Ruth said. "After 11 years of telling myself I didn't have one, you gave an old coward the chance to stop being one." Her eyes filled. "I'll die grateful to you, girl. And to your father who raised a daughter that walks toward the fire when every soul she's got tells her to run from it. And the debt, the $400, the real figure, the honest one, Clara insisted on paying it. Every cent out of the first good year the ranch had, because it was real, because her father had signed it with his own shaking hand, and meant it, and a Bennett paid what a Bennett owed. Caleb argued and lost, and understood that he'd married a woman who would no more leave an honest debt unpaid than she'd leave a dishonest one uncollected, and that the two things were the same thing in her, the same straight spine. And he stopped arguing and let her pay it, and was proud of her the whole time, in a way he couldn't have put into words. The valley changed after that. Not all at once and not into Paradise Valleys don't, but the fear went out of it. The particular fear of one man's shadow lying over everything, and in the space the fear left, people started to remember how to look each other in the eye. The town of Hollow Creek, which had gone silent and suspicious, when Caleb Whitaker rode through with a strange woman, learned his wife's name, and then learned to say it with something like respect, and then this took longer, learned to be a little ashamed of the silence they'd offered her at the start. Sam Doyle, who'd insulted her in the street, crossed to the other side of it whenever he saw her coming, and Clara let him, because a woman who'd faced down Victor Harrington had no time left over to spend on the Sam Doyles of the world. And on a summer morning a full year after a young woman had walked 40 miles up a mountain with a dead man's letter and nothing else, Caleb Whitaker stood at the paddock fence and watched his wife work a young horse in the early light. Watched her stand still and low and patient, the way she'd stood with the roan a year ago, letting the animal come to her hand, answering the question nobody else had bothered to answer. And he felt the thing he'd spent 11 years making sure he'd never feel again. And he let himself feel it all the way without flinching. Elias the roan grazed easy along the fence line, gentled and content, worth 4 times what Caleb would once have sold him for. The cabin behind them had a new room built onto it, and then another, because it had turned out they needed the room after all. And down in the paddock, the young horse finally lowered its head into Clara's waiting hand, and Clara laughed. The free, delighted laugh he'd first heard aimed at a horse a year ago, and had heard aimed at him more times than he could count since. And she looked up and caught Caleb watching her, and she didn't ask what he was thinking, because after a year she knew. "You've got that look again," she called across the paddock. "The one you had the morning you said 'I do' to the ceiling, only you're not looking at the ceiling this time." "No," Caleb said, "I'm not." She left the young horse and came to him at the fence and leaned on the rail beside him, close her shoulder against his, the way they stood most mornings now, and for a while, neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. "I've been thinking about your father," Caleb said finally. "Have you? I spent 9 years not knowing how to pay that man back. It ate at me. A debt you can't pay, it's a stone you carry. I'd have given him anything. Money, my life, anything he asked. And he never asked, and then he died, and I thought the debt died with him, and I'd carry that stone into my grave." He turned to look at her. "And then his daughter walked up my mountain, and I thought, here it is. Here's the bill come due, at last, and it's going to cost me everything, and I'll pay it because I owe it, and that'll be the end of me." His voice had gone rough. "I thought paying that debt was going to be the thing that took my whole life." Clara waited. "But it wasn't a bill, Clara," Caleb said quietly. "That's what I finally understand. Your father didn't send me a debt to pay. He sent me the only thing in the whole world that could give me my life back. He'd been watching me 9 years, and he knew what I'd done to myself up here. He knew I'd walled off everything worth living for, and he had one thing left to hand out before he died, and he spent it on me, on a man he met once bleeding in the mud." He shook his head slowly, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't care. "The stone I carried 9 years thinking it was a debt, it was a gift the whole time. He didn't send me a bill. He sent me you. And I've been trying to figure out how a man ever pays back a thing like that. And I finally got the answer." "What's the answer?" Clara said softly. "You don't." Caleb took her hand off the rail and held it in both of his. Her fingers warm now, always warm now, no trace left of the cold hand that had jammed itself in his door a year ago. "You don't pay it back. You just live it out, every day. You take the gift, and you honor it by being worth it. That's the only payment a thing like this'll take." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest over his heart, where a folded letter had once ridden into a fight, and where now there was only the steady beat of a man who'd finally stopped being afraid to have something to lose. "Your father saved my life at Two Rivers, Clara. But you're the one who gave it back to me. And I mean to spend every morning I've got left proving I was worth the both of you. Clara Bennett, Clara Whitaker. A full year now, and no longer anyone's arrangement, or anyone's debt, or anyone's thing to be decided in another room," looked up at her husband in the summer light, with her whole heart in her face. And she said the truest thing either of them had ever said. "He didn't save you, and I didn't give it back," she said. "Stop keeping the ledger, Caleb. There's no debt here. There never was, not really." Two people who'd both decided they had nothing left to lose walked up the same mountain, and they found out they were wrong. She smiled, and it was the smile he'd fall asleep to for the rest of his life. "We didn't save each other's lives. We just stopped living them alone." And that turned out to be the same thing. And Caleb Whitaker, the lonely rancher who'd sworn he would never love again, drew his wife in against him at the paddock fence in the bright, clean morning of the life they'd built out of a debt that turned out to be a gift. And he knew, with a certainty, he'd never once felt in 11 years of having nothing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly who he was meant to be with, and that no letter, no debt, no dead man's promise had brought him here in the end. She had, and he had, together. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it would be enough every morning for the rest of their lives.